Recording. Okay, let's get going. So, hi everyone. Welcome to 0x Salon number 3. My name is Wasim Al-Sindi, and we are going to have a discussion about a paper and concept called algorithmic realism, which was a recent accepted paper at the ACM Fairness, Accounting and Transparency conference by Ben Green and Salome Viljoen. And you can find that online by searching algorithmic realism ACM, and the subtitle is expanding the boundaries of algorithmic thought. So we're just going to introduce the panel that we've got, 5 people to discuss this paper, and then we'll do some introductions and some contextual framing. So I'm going to start by introducing Sherman Woschemgeer. So Sherman is an Austrian Persian researcher based at the Vienna University of Economics. She is the coordinator of the Crypto Economics Research Group, and she's the author of the recent Token Economy book, and many, many more things, which will probably come out in the discussion, but we'll keep it quite brief. So then I'll hand it over to Sherman to introduce Shebnem.
All right. So Shebnem is a wonderful human being I met, I think, 4 years ago in Berlin as I was running, prior to my activities in Vienna, running the blockchain hub here in Berlin. And we met over a conference, an energy conference, as I was speaking about DAOs. And so what fascinated me is that she has been working in distributed systems for, I don't know, a numerous number of years, even before Bitcoin was created. And she brings knowledge from distributed systems, cyber physical systems, and has been working in the industry and research, and is a very brilliant, open mind, and she really understands the potential of a token economy and this interconnected cyber physical web that will have this economic value layer and also the all the governance aspects of it. So we're I guess on the same road of discovery together. Yeah.
Nice.
Well said. So, and I'm going to introduce Zargam.
Zargam, yeah.
I met Zargam like a lot of these intellectual webs that get connected on Twitter through our work. And basically that was the time I think he was brewing Common Stack, and literally we connected over tokenizing energy. And when he first shared the model of Common Stack with me, I was like, what? Too complicated. And basically, but absolutely the essence of it, literally as simple as possible, but not much more. And this is what Zargam brings to the topic or to the table. As always, he's a polymath, but he can bring it and break it down to absolutely almost any audience. And and basically we connected now on the path of token engineering, and I just don't stop learning from him.
And then Z to introduce me. And just like very quickly, I want to say that Shebnem, I was following you on LinkedIn years ago. You were writing cool stuff on LinkedIn.
Yeah, that was maybe the start of it as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And maybe I forgot, but probably it is important to the whole topic that Zargam has also brought this tooling to token engineering, CAD, complex adaptive dynamics with computer-aided design, and that literally leveled up our game substantially.
Yeah. Okay, and then over to Z.
Cool. Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for the introduction. For Waseem, he's the managing editor of the journal on cryptoeconomic systems that's been spun out of MIT, but not specifically an MIT project. And we've had a wide range of conversations related to the use of models and algorithms, and even just the notion of epistemological transgression, something that's been a topic at this salon in the past. And the ongoing conversations have been incredibly valuable, both sort of with Waseem directly and actually his capacity to create environments for discussions between many different areas and to generally support mixing of ideas across disciplines and even across ways of analyzing or reasoning about what we know and don't know and the implications thereof. So it's sort of been an honor to have conversations, and I'm looking forward to this one.
Thanks, E. It's always nice to hear somebody say something nice. I suppose when you're on the call with them, they kind of a bit restricted in what they can say. So I'm going to introduce Laura. So Laura is a very good friend of mine. She's a fellow member of Trust. So I'm missing her now that Trust is half empty. But we have done quite a few of these kinds of discussions by now. So I know I can always count on Laura to bring like a more refined and better read philosophical background to these discussions. So people like Zagam and I, we're more trespassers than anything else. So we're just moving between domains and we don't really have very deep subject knowledge. So I lean quite heavily on Laura and other friends like Laura who actually have done the homework, have done the reading, know which people spoke about which ideas and how they're interconnected. And so like in terms of Laura's professional work, so she has a PhD from the University of New South Wales. She's been writing papers on things like the affordances that blockchain can give, the new possibilities for decentralized brands that arise from this kind of blockchain Web3 ecosystem. And she spends her days writing reports on various sectors of the cryptocurrency world, which I think it's a bit of a shame that they don't see the light of day. And actually, this is my only criticism of Laura, is that she doesn't share much of her writing and her work. So there's a paper that I'd really like to read of hers that's going through review at the moment. She still hasn't sent it to me, and there's only so much like tapping on the shoulder that I can do. But Laura's really great foil to have in these kinds of conversations. So very much looking forward to having her here. And Laura, if you want to finish off by telling them all, oh no, we're done. You did me. That's it. Perfect. So like we closed the loop. Perfect. All right. So maybe a little bit of context, like in terms of the paper and why it's interesting, why I think it's interesting. So I actually can't remember when I came across it, but it must have been before we went to Den Haag, Z, because I mentioned it when you gave your talk, and you finished your talk talking about algorithmic governance, talking about the kind of traffic light, how to manage just an algorithmic governance system, with one of the simplest canonical examples being a traffic light system. And at that point, you finished your talk, you got a round of applause, and I very rudely shouted, "Are you taking comments?" and then I mentioned this paper because I think it's really relevant to that line of thought where anyone can design a traffic light system in a vacuum. But when you put this thing on an intersection, then you've got cyclists, you've got pedestrians, you've got ambulances, you've got drunk drivers, you've got coronavirus zombies, who knows? And so like it requires us to think differently about how we design and implement and throw these things out. And so I think we've seen a lot in the last 10 years of like blockchain world, regardless of how much time you've actually spent of that 10 years in the space, of people being like what I would characterize as being overly formalist in their approaches. Kind of this code is law, unstoppable code. We just write the thing and Bitcoin does what it does, and that's, so the idea being that you form these things in a vacuum, you push them out into the world, and they're correct because we designed them in vitro correctly. Once they go out into the world, that's that. And so I like this paper because it kind of forces you to take a step back from this idea that we can create everything in the laboratory perfectly in our own kind of image or in our own minds, and then push them out and there's no consequences. So this is really a paper kind of calling to arms, like a call to arms, not just about blockchains, all kinds of algorithms, about how we can do better do better so that we don't cause so there aren't unintended consequences, so there aren't harms that come out of the misapplication or the unintended function of these systems. And so the first slide that we're looking at now, the picture at the bottom is it's kind of a schematic representation of the various kinds of some trolley problems, which is kind of a classic meme that moral philosophers like to use. The idea being that if you have to make a decision between A and B, and something bad happens on A and something bad happens on B, how do you decide? And I think this is quite relevant to the realism, because it starts from the premise that something is going wrong. Like, it tells you that not all is not well with the world, with the system that you inhabit, and that's already kind of a realist perspective. And so it's in my opinion, that's quite a nice place to start. So what do you think, guys? Should we jump in and we start to talk about, we've got the abstract of the paper, so we can pick through that. I picked out some excerpts from that, and then maybe we can go from there. How does that sound?
Good.
Sounds good.
All right. Are we working? Yes, we are working. Okay, great. So, yeah, my opinion, the mark of a good paper is the abstract. And so if the paper is really good, you probably don't even need to read it. Like, the abstract should give you enough, like the irreducible form of the idea, that you can roll with that yourself and then fill in the gaps as you return to it. And in my opinion, this is one of those papers. It spends a lot of time on legal stuff, which is, again, it would have been nice to have Prima in the room, but never mind. I would say that we'll probably background the legal stuff, except for the analogy they draw to complete the circle. All right, so the abstract. Although computer scientists are eager to help address social problems, the field faces a growing awareness that many well-intentioned applications of algorithms in social contexts have led to significant harm. We argue that addressing this gap between the field's desire to do good and the harmful impacts of many of the videos are in the way of the okay, many of its interventions requires looking to the epistemic and methodological underpinnings of algorithms. And so, like, we should make sure that we don't leave people behind with funny words. So I think the only funny word in here is epistemic. And so when we talk about epistemology or things being epistemic, we're basically talking about systems and theories of knowledge. So this is not the things themselves. This is our ways of understanding these things, our conceptual frameworks, our lenses. And so what this is, like, this paper is trying to provide additional set of lenses for people. You could say algorithmic designers, you could say token engineers, to think about what they do as they do it. Okay, so this is kind of their diagnosis, which is, we diagnose the dominant mode of algorithmic reasoning as algorithmic formalism, and we describe how formalist orientations lead to harmful algorithmic interventions. Addressing these harms requires pursuing a new mode of algorithmic thinking that is attentive to the internal limits of algorithms and to the social concerns that fall beyond the bounds of algorithmic formalism. So I think that's, it's not covering too much new ground there, basically saying that we need to look outside of our formulas if we want to understand the impact of what we're creating.
Exactly. And the basically when I first read that, I was like, the thing that drew my attention was actually that a sector went through this journey already. Like, it was actually great info that the legal formalism was replaced by something that's called legal realism. Mm-hmm. And that was like, oh, but why did Lessig, who's I think he's from law, why did he postulate code is law, which the techies just said, yes, code is law, because that did just resonate with first of all, maybe what could go wrong, and if I programmed it and the compiler compiled it, this is the algorithmic reality.
Mm-hmm. But something like
code mindset of a programmer. So
yeah, but something like code is law. I mean, again, like let's not get too diverted right now, but like, it's interesting because it's very much an epithet in the blockchain space. But I wonder if something like Lessig's formulation of code is law would have benefited from a clarification between algorithms and the applications of them, the systems that they.
I actually think that the you know, the refinement that I think is realistic is to think policy. If you think of policy as a subset of law, then sure. But in fact, what we're really doing in is drawn from the sort of controls engineering literature, is that you literally describe the processes through which an algorithm makes decisions as policies. Not they're not in fact you know, objective. You're choosing them from a variety of, you make modeling assumptions. I'm sure we'll talk about that later. But actually in this framing, I think the algorithmic formalism versus algorithmic realism, you could argue that at least in practice, the vast majority of control systems engineering is observing noisy, messy things, filtering out parts of it, making assessments or assertions or, you know, estimations, constructing beliefs, then make forward. And so the paradigm contingent on those beliefs, actuating as a result of the outcomes, and then observing the new states and re-estimating and moving forward. And so the paradigm of treating algorithms less for their formal sort of internally proven properties and more for the sort of systems outcomes, it's the actual purview of most of the systems and control engineering discipline, which is what's given us things like, you know, aircraft and whatnot, and higher order combinations of systems. And I think there's a lot of cross mixing to come in the application of the sort of computer science-y new algorithms and tools being applied to social systems where, yeah, there's going to be some differences. There's a lot that we can't map one-to-one, but this very notion that the algorithms are actually policies is a stepping stone for understanding their subjective and performative elements.
I would like to introduce, so I think we have to mind the language that we use. So some of you come from cyber-physical systems, so you use a specific set of vocabulary and taxonomy. But if we talk about algorithms, modern day algorithms, like maybe before the internet algorithms or systems that were created like more in the physical world, building bridges, roads, space shuttles, they were not like kind of a governance layer for the whole society. They addressed a specific problem, right? Whereas ever since the internet, we're building more and more algorithms that are like the base layer and institutional, and this is where kind of base layer of how we coordinate life. And we have institutional economics and social science sees like procedures and institution are all the procedures and formalisms that that we define, formal and informal procedures that we have defined over time of how we want to coordinate our socioeconomic interactions. And now we can use internet-based algorithms to do that. So I think we need to adopt language from institutional economics and political science to address these issues. Otherwise, we will never get those on board who have the knowledge from the social sciences field, and social sciences field is also quite diverse, and they have their own. So I coming from an economics background, I tend to refer to institutional economics, but there is a huge crossover to political science, and they have their own set of vocabulary there. So it is a pity actually that, was it Primavera? Who was supposed to come? I mean, she would have her own set of vocabulary here, and that would have been important. So yeah, I guess the most important aspect here is we are providing new institutions, especially in this new internet, this new decentralized internet that we're creating, and where we're creating an economic layer for this type of physical system, and it's a socioeconomic layer. So just referring to it, so yeah. So I think we need vocabulary.
The social side, yeah.
We will the right set of vocabulary, and that process takes a long time, I guess.
We
right?
should hear from Laura. Yeah, Laura is our social scientist. Like in the absence of Prima, Laura will help us out here, I'm sure.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think this could be like a great moment to introduce like some definitions of algorithm vis-a-vis, for instance, models, because it's definitely true that algorithms have moved from the very simple definition of, say, recipe or like set of instructions into actual models for, say, actually creating or instantiating something like institutions. And so I think there is something there that maybe could be like expanded upon a little bit, particularly, I guess, coming from the more scientific engineering side, some rigorous definition of models, which I think goes into helping us perhaps understanding the ways in which these more advanced forms of algorithms get to actually create some kind of realities, like the realities of network cultures, for instance, that we all live in. Like for the way in which they model like institutions, they begin instantiating those.
So it sounds like we want to go more towards the definition, like algorithmic definitions first, and then we'll come back to the philosophical ones. Does that sound good? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That works. Can I make a question for?
But an algorithm is an institution, in my opinion, and I think we need to understand that, or we should discuss that. Is an algorithm an institution? And I think internet-based algorithms that coordinate how we can interact over the internet are, in my opinion, from my point of view, would represent an institution, an automated institution, right?
But is it the algorithm or is it a system that the algorithm implements? Is it the algorithm itself or is it the system that the algorithm implements?
Yeah.
That's a valid discussion. I think this is the discussion we should have. That would be great if we could take part of the time today to discuss this. I think it's both, right? So there's probably, but in the end, to simplify it, algorithms represent institutions, and they are systems and represent institutions, right?
That's a horribly unbearable truth for a programmer. You know, if you can imagine, requirements engineering part is the one that deals with the human stuff, but once we have our requirements, we can go just, headphones on and just code. A lot of creativity might come in, but the compiler is going to tell you whether it's going to work or not. And from that, when I thought, okay, I have to be very, conscious about what is being deployed out there, I can go the formalism path, literally show that the algorithm is correct.
Yeah, but like on a legal level, the Constitution is the compiler.
Please take this apart, but I just want to give you the mind frame or mindset of a programmer that means well. And so they know from the requirement side, someone did the job good, hopefully, but they just do the development, testing and whatever, even formal verification. But then the thing that this algorithm is going to go out there, interact with a physical or human system or institution or be the coordinating thing, that's entirely new. And as Arjan put it, for cyber-physical system engineers, like engineering an Airbus actually is something that people think about. But if you just were developing web apps that crash all the time, you didn't develop this mindset. And literally with tokenization and blockchain, those people who didn't have this mindset are pulled into what Sherman just represented or just explained, and that's a huge culture clash. That's a huge, really uncomfortable state where people are put in, and literally they need a lot of translation and a lot of hand-holding, maybe a lot of coaching as well. So please take that part.
Yeah, let's finish the abstract, then we can jump into like unpicking the algorithms themselves. So formalism to legal realism. Understand what a methodological evolution is. Let's finish the abstract, then we can jump into like unpicking the algorithms themselves. So to understand what a methodological evolution beyond what formalism looks like and what it may achieve, we turn to the 20th century evolution in American legal thought from legal formalism to legal realism. Drawing on the lessons of legal realism, we propose a new mode of algorithmic thinking, algorithmic realism, that provides tools for computer scientists to account for the realities of social life and of algorithmic impacts. These realist approaches, although not foolproof, will better equip computer scientists to reduce algorithmic harms and to reason well about doing good. So I don't think there's any silver bullet in here. It's really just like, it's more of a bitter pill for coders to swallow. And so I guess, like, this is what I think the aims of the paper are. And so we'll do this, and then we'll get to the kind of what is an algorithm thing. We'll loop back to the philosophy. So the aims and focus of the paper, as I understood it, were that they were looking for the relationship between algorithmic thinking, which is how algorithms are taught, understood, formulated, and algorithmic interventions, which is the implementation of them in the wild, how algorithms are deployed to address specific problems. I don't want to say social problems, it says there, but we say specific problems, let's say. We are specifically interested in interrogating the influence of algorithmic thinking on algorithmic interventions, and focus on the application of optimization of machine learning algorithms. That was their focus. Obviously, we can take this in any other direction. The divergent meanings of algorithms within critical discourse and computer science reflects differences between algorithms in theory and the algorithmic systems, intricate dynamic arrangements of people and code that exist in practice. So I think there's something like the start of a definition there, in terms of at least the definition, the comparative definition between an algorithm itself and a system that it implements. Understanding the relationships between these two notions of algorithms, the algorithm itself and the system, requires us approaching algorithms as multiples, unstable objects that are enacted through the very practices that people use to engage with them. And this comes to Z's point, which we'll get to in a second. And algorithmic thinking can then be thought of and understood as a mode of reasoning. It shapes how computer scientists see the world, understand problems, and develop solutions to those problems. And like all methodologies, algorithmics rely on defining the bounds of its analysis. So there's quite a lot to chew on in there. There's the start of the definition of, or the comparative definition between algorithms and algorithmic systems, as we were sort of touching on earlier. I think that the next part is quite interesting. The relationship between the algorithms as multiples, unstable objects that are enacted through the very practices that people use to engage them. And this is a bit like the loop definition that we were talking about a little bit before. Does anybody want to roll with this before we jump into we go further? Yeah, I thought you would.
Yeah, right. Of course. So, I mean, there's a couple things that I wanted to key in on here, but I think the first most important is the notion of these multiples or these combinations of things, because there's a ongoing, and again, research, very formal, arguably on the formalism side of things, called sort of open games and sort of compositions of operators in general. And, you know, what I hear when we talk about this is the difference between the closed system formalism that says this thing does this versus the sort of open system formalism still, I guess, where you start combining things and the underlying properties start to like break down and recombobulate into system level properties that are not totally described by the algorithms or the subsystems. And so there's this sort of aspect of composition, at least for me, that separates the notion of the algorithmic policy or component or sort of logical procedure as it was designed, and the system that is realized by composing that logical procedure with other stuff, whether that's people or even other algorithms or, you know, processes. And I think, at least as I would recommend it, one can best think about this as a sort of internal view, in the sense of examining the algorithm and the procedure itself, versus a sort of external view, which is examining the algorithm or the procedure as part of a broader context. So you have a systems view, and then you have a sort of component or parts view, and they give you fundamentally different perspectives, so you actually can't drop one for the other. You need to actually be able to take both perspectives in order to adequately engineer or design an algorithm with the intent of a real outcome as opposed to just a theoretical outcome.
And to translate this into institutional social science language that everyone can understand, we already have algorithms that control our socioeconomic interactions, which is our constitutions are like kind of the system macro behavior that we have defined, and then we built like kind of it's this theoretical rule set and the boundaries of how we want to kind of create, or like the boundaries in which our socioeconomic interactions can happen. And based on our constitutional definitions, we built simple laws. And maybe to bring the reference to the compiler you used before, Shebnem, we do have that in social systems as well, and we're building social systems with these algorithms, right? So the compiler in the end is the constitution. You can build, you can define a new law, and then in reality this law doesn't play out well, and it can be contested in front of the courts, various courts, and it can be revoked again if it doesn't meet constitutional requirements. So, yeah.
One question in that sense again. So also interventions not being algorithmic are already something people need or must think about, especially when the one intervening is entirely absolutely elevated from the people who are being affected by that intervention. Is there already a...
It's the principal agent theory, again, institutional economics, and there's also what actually Bitcoin and the crypto world often refers to, like this principal agent dilemma, etc. So algorithms are a code of conduct of how something should behave, and we have, like before the advent of computers, that code was written in texts at first as the Bible, and as kind of spiritual scriptures. In religions, we had the Bible and the Torah, etc. And then with Roman law, we had the revolution, and we moved away from this fuzzy logic of the Bible of when God will be mad. So that was kind of all these stories were intended to steer behavior of people and provide a set of norms upon which we would know how to behave in society. And that was then replaced by Roman law, which is now being replaced by blockchain algorithms. And before blockchain, already Web 2 based algorithms that already on a business to consumer level started to coordinate human interaction. So again, we should talk about algorithms, but we lose people if we don't say that an algorithm, any law is also an algorithm. Or in the end, an algorithm is a codified version of how we should behave online, right?
So one thing that came up when Z was talking was I started to think of the algorithm as part of the greater whole, part of the system. Then I thought maybe you can think of an algorithm as a socio-technical or cyber-physical primitive, and that's something that fits inside this greater system. That maybe it's the discriminator, as you say. It's the way that policies are created or things are decided. So one of the analogies that I like to come back to when we think about algorithms, something very simple that anyone can understand, like a cooking recipe.
No, they're formalized. The policies are formalized in the algorithm. The decision process is done by human beings in a fuzzy way, just as any other decision-making process. Yeah. And
Go ahead.
And the system level is like our kind of definitions of what type of system we want to create upon which set of basic rules, right? And then we deploy some kind of algorithm. We used to call this algorithm law, right? And then we see that this law needs fine-tuning, and sometimes it needs more fine-tuning, and sometimes it needs less fine-tuning, and sometimes we have to ditch it altogether, and sometimes we have discussions over years, and then we have secession. Yeah, we've had that in the analog world, and we're seeing the same thing in the physical world.
So in an attempt to build a bridge to the simple analogy of a recipe, what I would say, though, is that the algorithm is a procedure, and it's a procedure that is administrated through a compiler, say. But in fact, what we can jump to for a moment is there's a decision-making aspect in a law that says, like, if this, then that. And we're saying that that could be reduced to a procedure. And then we're looking at the way that the sort of procedure exists in a sort of purely social context, like the recipe for cooking analogy, versus in a sort of technologically mediated case where we're talking about, say, those procedures sort of enshrined in code and then executed in some environment, and this sort of extent to which we're beholden to their outcomes. And I think there's a lot entangled in these words: algorithm, policy, recipe, procedure, law, etc. And I mean, it sounds like there's still a lot of room for us to unpack it. I'm going to kind of throw it back to Waseem, though, because I'd like to play with the recipe procedure example just to try to bring this down a notch.
Yeah, I mean, because it's the simplest analogy I can think of. It's the simplest instantiation or example, and like I think everybody understands a cooking recipe. Everybody's followed a cooking recipe, for better or for worse. And whether you got the chocolate fudge brownie that you desired at the end of it or not. And so, what is it? It's a set of it's a formalization of a set of instructions, and if you follow those instructions, it should be precise and repeatable to some extent. I mean, the cooking recipe is not the airtight analogy, because if you add more chocolate or you add less sugar, you will still get the thing. This is actually, as a chemist, I was very jealous of cooking recipes because I was following chemical synthesis recipes. You don't get to eat the thing at the end. It takes years to follow. You make like micrograms of powders. And so, but the analogy of the recipe is nice, because then we can kind of take it further to delineate between the algorithm and the system. And so me writing my recipe for chocolate fudge brownies is just an algorithm. We haven't implemented that. We haven't pushed it into the wild. So if I make a recipe for chocolate fudge brownies and I put potassium cyanide in that recipe, I haven't hurt anyone by creating the algorithm. But once that algorithm is implemented, once people start cooking, say it goes in my best-selling cookbook, once people start using that, then this then harm is created from you can't even say that there's a lack of understanding of the consequences. Those consequences are probably quite deliberate. But the implementation of the algorithm into the system, into something that exists in the wild, is where the kind of real world impact comes from.
Or when people use your soap recipe and create bomb.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of like they're making their own algorithms now. And like, I don't know what we have to also be realistic about other people's algorithms, right? Not just our own. I mean, people are always going to be doing that shit.
Well, and I think a couple things here. One is that, there's a natural composability of algorithms, or really just of procedures, right? So if you create a procedure, that procedure has some, elements that it provides, and if someone then composes that as a sub procedure in another procedure, to what extent or is the original procedure creator responsible for what follows? There's actually interesting, in the sort of chemistry examples, we can talk about dynamite and the sort of applications of explosives and the extent to which the creator's intent and the sort of overwhelming use of the technology were misaligned. But to kind of go back to the cooking recipe example, we wanted to ideally talk about the social systems versus algorithms. And so what we had discussed in a previous conversation was that with the cooking recipe where you put cyanide in your brownies, maybe for that almondy, no, sorry, terrible joke. At first order, it could have actually been a joke, right? Imagine that Wasim made a joke about almondy brownies with cyanide. He made a chemistry joke. Now here's a problem. If someone then finds it and doesn't understand or doesn't know that, and they start a cooking club and they use Wasim's joke recipe book with a bunch of dark chemistry jokes in it, and they start a cooking club using using that cookbook, and people actually die from having made these things, then we're going to get back to this sort of trolley problem moral philosophy discussion. Mm-hmm. Was it wrong for Wasim to write a book of dark chemistry cooking jokes if there's a risk of, in the future, someone finding that book, interpreting it as an actual cooking book, and then suppose a institution is formed in the form of this community cooking club, and then people start cooking those things. And so there's a weird mixing happening between Wasim's knowledge, expertise, intent, the procedures he wrote, the instantiation of those procedures in text, the taking of that text into the context of some other institution, the implementation of those procedures in the cooking itself, and the resulting outcomes in the real world. What the hell just happened, right? That's kind of where we're at with algorithms in general these days.
Yeah, it's messy to begin with, right?
Right. Even in this super toy, simple, maybe stylized case, we're seeing ridiculous consequences potentially of each individual step being maybe not so crazy.
Yeah, interdependencies and downstream consequences. Yeah.
So maybe this, I love this analogy and the dark cooking recipe joke, which reminds me that context is king, right? So having the context of a procedure is very important. But again, I would like to step back because we tend to discuss things, especially in the digital world, when it comes to engineering, very often like we need to reinvent the wheel. But these type of contextualized discussions humankind has had this in the interpretation of the first written text, which were the Bibles and the Torahs of the world. Interpreting, running it through the right compiler of what the context of the writing was at that time, and is very important. But very often for things that were created maybe 2,000 years ago, we don't have that, or things that were created as word by mouth and lost context along the line, or blurred, and the context blurred along the line. And I think it's very important to understand that these early religious texts were institutions also that had a context, and not knowing what the context is brought upon many, many discussions at best and wars at worst. And we're seeing the same things happen in the algorithmic world, maybe not so much in the Web 2, because it was very company-centric, shareholder-centric. I'm the shareholder, I decide. It's like privatized discussions. But now in the Web 3, we are democratizing these discussions, because these networks and then are being they're collaborative networks, so we have much more of those discussions, which is why it's very important to understand that there's much we can learn from history, and there is a great overlap, obviously, also into the traditional engineering sciences and cyber-physical systems. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Laura, you've been kind of quiet. Are you there?
Yeah. I'm here. I wanted to go back a second to the recipe analogy to then come back to this kind of more institutional kind of like questions, and maybe, I don't know, bringing maybe some like software studies kind of perspectives, but think in terms of something like I don't know, Google PageRank, right? Like a algorithm that is used daily, like by millions of people, and so just trying to see if I'm understanding correctly. When you're talking about the algorithm as a recipe, that would be the formalization of the algorithm that says that on my browser, I get to see this type of information, and that this information at times contains certain assumptions and contains certain, the autocomplete kind of aspect as well, like for instance. But then precisely thinking about the type of social consequences that creates, that maybe I don't know whether it's something that the recipe analogy captures, but that I think certainly maybe the thinking in terms of, I don't know, the Bible of this older maybe type of institution, the type of reality that creates. So if we think about the type of reality that, say, something like a search engine algorithm creates at the level of knowledge production on a daily basis, I think that is something that still remains perhaps a little underexplored, but I do think that that's precisely the realism, perhaps, that comes to the fore in very daily kind of ways.
If you wouldn't mind, I'll make a cross-reference to the field of network science, which has actually done quite a bit of more, I would say, realism approaching academic and field work on these kinds of algorithms. And with the example of PageRank, it's actually a pretty good one for separating between the algorithm and the system, in the sense that the algorithm is essentially a particular ranking algorithm. It's a specific family of mixing processes over graphs that can be implemented and computed and provide scores. And then by returning results as a function of those scores through a centralized sort of, logically centralized point, say Google itself, what you actually create at the system level is a sort of preferential attachment model, or a sort of rich get richer dynamic of the form that attention is increased on the things that score well on it, and that in turn results in more links to that thing. So it changes the underlying graph that was being measured as a result of, say, the PageRank algorithm. And so the system actually includes this second order feedback where the specific instance of the algorithm PageRank induced a dynamic on the system or the graph that it was measuring, which changed the shape of the graph over time. And so I would argue that actually reading more about PageRank as a textbook example in the network science literature is a good way for people who are coming either from computer science or from social science to start to reconcile the sort of algorithm versus system relationship in real life, not just in theory.
But it had to take over decades of realism and experience to actually capture what the outcome would be. That, I don't know, for example, small businesses' livelihoods depend on this being ranked high or low, or if this organization changes the algorithmic logic, all of a sudden they lose their livelihood.
Well, the whole system, it changed beyond that. SEO, whatever, it's a search engine optimization literally came into existence to fill the niche that you're describing, that it became so critical to do well on search engines that it became its own area of, again, this is an operational thing, not a theoretical thing. We didn't have someone necessarily predicting, oh, we need search engine optimization. It emerged as a service that you could buy precisely because of the phenomena you're describing, Shebnem.
So how am I even supposed to get real if the things that can happen with my algorithm are going to unfold decades later? And literally, I think this context, that web development's context is changing. And now we're not just talking about tech clouds gone wrong, but really your identity, your wealth, everything can be, entirely yours or gone in a minute because someone fucked up the wallet algorithm.
Yeah, it's really timely of now as well. When we see, we're here in April 2020 in the COVID scene, and every day there's a new government pronouncement or a policy suggestion. Look for example at this contact tracing, the various contact tracing proposals that are going around at the moment, and these seem to be kind of like, if you look at them in a certain way, they look like irreversible smash and grabs on people's privacy and liberty. And you could argue whether the potential harms of not going down that road are outweighed by the potential harms of implementing these kinds of technologies. But it seems that realism is also kind of it doesn't seem to be paid enough respect when people are panicking in this kind of reactionary sense. But the question about
I'd like to bring back, because now that we're talking about the crisis, I would like to step back into the social science field, or like into our legal system and our policy making system. And if we look at central banks, very crucial at this time in history, the policies that central banks set over kind of monetary policy right now, or that they have set before, are crucial to the resilience of how these algorithms, so we call it policy, but in the end it's an algorithm. And the same monetary policies that have been implemented by nation states or on a nation state level together with central banks and fiscal policy, etc., are now being implemented as algorithmic tools to create, for example, stable tokens in the crypto world. So it's exactly the same policies, and we're calling it algorithmic stable token. So and if we talk about algorithmic realism, we have this problem every day in policy making, in the political realm. So central banks decide upon, for example, a policy, a monetary policy, and that can go well for a while or not, and then they need to adjust because maybe, for example, such as now, the conditions have significantly changed, and we have to think about another quantitative easing round that will be probably the biggest quantitative easing that the world has seen up until now, or not. And we will see how this change of policy, the adaptation to the realism of our world now, where it will take us. So again, this is where we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Policymakers face this realism problem every day.
Okay,
whether it's central banks or simple laws, who gets welfare in a situation like that? That's an algorithmic realism. It's called policymaking.
So maybe we don't need to reinvent the wheel, but we need to reinvent the real. So shall we do a little bit of the philosophical definitions, unpacking the differences, similarities, differences between idealism, formalism, and realism. Now, I'm not well qualified to do this, so I'm relying on all of you to jump in if I say something wrong, especially Laura. Please help me out here. So it was okay when I was talking to a bunch of Bitcoin developers last week. They weren't going to catch me out, but I feel a bit more exposed today. Okay, so if we talk about idealism, and again, I've just taken this from Wikipedia and Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So this is very basic definitions and framing. So the idea of idealism is that reality is created by our thoughts and by our perception. Nothing exists except thoughts in a very simple sense. And it's kind of nice to think about a couple of different branches of idealism. So you can think of epistemological realism as taking the view that the contents of human knowledge are determined entirely by the structure of human thought, by the way that we arrange ideas and form systems of knowledge. And you can separate that out from ontological idealism, which is the view that epistemological idealism delivers truth because reality itself as a form of thought. Like, so this is kind of trying to separate out whether what we see is real in itself, or it's a figment of our imagination if it's creation of thought. And now this is kind of like a philosophical dead end, so we don't really need to spend too long discussing it unless somebody's got some really burning things to add. Like I haven't read much Hume or Kant, so I'm not really well placed to say. Laura, do you have anything to say?
No, actually, I mean, not specifically about epistemological ontological idealism, but as I was reading the slides, I was thinking about as a bit of a self-critique, perhaps, to the social studies of technologies, or like a bit of the, I don't know, anthropology in relation to technology. There is, I find, like I feel a bit of a tendency of something like a bit of a idealistic tendency to like think that the social, or like social uses of technology can, you know, can do anything. Like, and I think there is a bit, perhaps not enough attention to, you know, call it affordances, or like maybe just call it the embedded formalism. There's a lot of work obviously going into, you know, excavating the assumptions that are often embedded into technological systems or algorithms. But I do feel that at times from the social sciences, there is a bit of the idealistic, perhaps, the position in that sense. Yeah, just do it like that. It's, and so this is where I also find the, you know, this algorithmic realism as like an interesting corrective, perhaps, to bridge or these two polar, you know, opposite within the idealistic position at the level, for instance, of like social studies, and on the other hand, the, you know, the technological formalism. So that.
Yeah. So and with respect to that, actually two things do emerge. So one thing, reality and idealism. Idealism somehow relates to the model and the model thinking when you're developing systems. And the second thing there was reality in some ways indistinguishable. So if you talk about tokenized systems that incentivize people to do things, that thing is going to make people to do things, and that will become reality, right? So, and whether it is legitimate that it should become reality, or whether we just manipulated people on global scale because tokenization works like a charm, that's the big philosophical question.
Yeah. Yeah, I think where we are today is kind of somewhere between, like this idealism and the formalism, which we'll get to next, but depending on which area and which mode of action the people are using. So
I want to make a comment, and this goes to our talks at the conference, which is about the difference between being polyepistemological and being interdisciplinary, and specifically that I would argue that one needs to be able to take the different epistemological perspectives in parallel, in the sense that the systems don't fully represent themselves, or these concepts don't fully, you can't work with them if you can only look at them from an idealistic, a formalistic, or a realistic perspective, and that developing the capability as a researcher even, or as a designer, or whatever role you're going to take, to step between those is actually almost more important than any one of them.
Yeah. And maybe, Michael, what do you think? I mean, if talking about realism, our micro, meso, macro perspective on crypto economic system completely fits this realism feedback loop, I would say.
I definitely think there's important overlaps. I think the challenge is that you still have to create that representation. So you have a sort of formalism. It's just a looser formalism, which means it has more room for the realism to creep in. And that's why I made analogies early on to the control theory in robotics and cyber physical systems, because I think that subdomain of engineering already contends with at least to some extent, a formalism, realism, at least, sort of parity, where you have an abstracted formalism that's got room left in it for degrees of freedom to be collapsed only in the observation of reality, and that there's a natural tension, and that just opens up this broader picture where I say, well, actually, you kind of need to be able to think about them kind of both at the same time in order to, I guess, really make things that are in the realism paradigm using tools that come from the formalism paradigm.
Yeah. And I think maybe the realism implies being dynamic, right? Because whatever ideal system you would like to create, you always create it based on a limited knowledge about how the future will evolve, or limited computing power about the more complex the system is. So the ideal model of a system we create and the real thing that comes out of it might diverge, and then we need this feedback loop of adjusting the model and the algorithm, and so we have this continuous feedback loop, which is dynamic over time, especially as the more complex a system is, and as conditions change.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing, Sherman, that the kind of the imposition or the addition of realism into the framework allows this kind of the closing the loop, the iteration of the feedback. Shall we move to formalism?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So this is a bit more of a recent idea, and I think the best way to encapsulate the idea of formalism is that you're looking for form over content, or that the rules of the game are the most important thing, in that there's no transcendent meaning or additional context to that discipline or activity other than the literal content created by the practitioners. And so this lends itself well to disciplines based on axiomatic systems like logic and mathematics. And as the paper says, the truth expressed in these fields are not about numbers, sets, triangles, or other kinds of objects. These objects aren't about anything unless they're given some context, some interpretation, and some semantics. And so conceptually speaking, this is a topic that we covered on the first salon where we're looking at abstraction. Formalizing a problem can lead to some analytical clarity. You're making some reduction, you're making some simplifications. And practically speaking, formalizing a problem can make complex problems tractable. So something that you may not be able to write a closed form expression for, or a recipe list for, that may become simpler as you go through this reductive process. So formalism also has significant limitations. The danger is not in the formal methods per se, but the failure to recognize the limits of the formal insights, and in the uncritical deployment of formal methods in complex social contexts where the assumptions may be invalid. So this is almost like saying that the formalism itself isn't the problem, but formalism maximalism is the problem, that you don't see the forest for the trees, right?
Yeah.
This is something that actually is very, very close to my heart, and I'm going to say, you know, it was referenced earlier, the complex adaptive dynamics computer-aided design stuff that I've worked on. It's sort of like basically modeling tools, Python, etc., for actually testing algorithms and policies in a more sort of control theoretic framework. But to be blunt with regard to this, the point is to be making assumptions and the limitations of formalisms explicit, and to sort of slam on them a bit computationally, but, you know, A/B testing and sensitivity testing and failure mode testing, the kind of stuff that we have in engineering, but over, again, models of social systems, which unfortunately have a whole lot more places where you have to do that because you know that you don't know stuff. But I'm going to say that, like, you know, Shebnem in particular had this quote at one of her talks about version controlling your assumptions. And I think that's what's missing from the application of formalism in a lot of social systems as it exists in what I'd say like the more engineering mechanistic systems, is that you have a better, you know what you don't know, and so you test it. And we have a burden with these social systems to spend more energy like fleshing out all of the things we're assuming implicitly, make them explicit, and then sort of test the sensitivity, and not just in a one at a time way, which can hide some sort of hidden nonlinear interaction effect. So there's a real burden going forward for this sort of high dimensional sensitivity testing over wide ranges of things that we know we don't know.
Yeah. And there is also a difference in attitude or this awareness, I think, between software developers who develop algorithms for critical infrastructures that are more closer to this control system and physical systems. And just, as said, developers and algorithm designers for the web, for example, right? And that big gap is being uncritical in a sense, like, did we have 100% test coverage in unit tests? Yes, we're golden. That's where it stops, right? And now we have to really start these talks, and it started already, but only through these data-driven systems, algorithms that learn from data. There is the first time when a developer realized, oops, okay, things are happening. We don't have it under control unless we do, because we're the ones choosing the data to feed these algorithms. We determine what they learn. They learn from our biases and so on and so forth. And this is the first time, just 2 years back or something, where it really started to come in mainstream. And I would say in crypto, I don't think this dawned on us already, that we say, okay, in Web3, when the moment we are basically embedding software economic layers into social webs, that's when things cannot be just uncritically deployed.
Tokenize the world, and don't think about the consequences.
Tokenize all the things. And I'm guilty of that. So I was. Yeah. But I'm on the path of awareness.
It's time to get real. So, Laura, do you want to say anything about formalism?
No, I mean, I think you covered it very well. And I like the emphasis on the formalist maximalism being perhaps what becomes problematic.
Yeah, I mean, really, really, we're talking about, these are all like extreme cases. And then, we can be living anywhere on this kind of trade-off trilemma, I suppose you could say.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're all necessary in a sense. You obviously need a certain degree of formalism to be able to even come up with the specs for a system, I suppose. You need a certain idealism, I suppose, to try and create something that can change the world for the better, or all this. But on the other hand, I think the realism comes into being able to entertain both, and the unintended consequences that may arise, particularly as we begin talking about crypto and what does it mean to begin embedding transactions into any kind of potential social interaction. So, yeah,
there's a really interesting point there that Shebnem was touching on earlier about when systems go out of control. I don't even know with this Web3 blockchain stuff if we would know if a system had, inverted commas, lost control. Like it's, these systems are complicated enough, even in the simplest examples. When we start talking about these, multi-agent blockchain systems, it's very hard to even know if things are going according to plan or not.
It's not even that in these truly sort of decentralized framings.
Steering. Yeah.
In this Web3 version of this discourse, there isn't even a notion of a central planner per se. There's only a bunch of individual perspectives on the sort of goals and maybe some norms and shared values about the goals, but there's actually no one set of objective optimization functions that the system is either in control with respect to, and there's maybe some constraints. So if we talk about it in the sort of formal setting of of optimization, dynamic or otherwise, you have objectives and you have constraints. And so a system's safety is generally a constraint, something you don't ever violate. And it's fine as long as you stay within the set of valid states. And if you are into some at-risk states, you might have some policies that help return you to the safe states before you could, ever get out of a set of layers of, say, sequentially more, oh my gosh, you can't be here states that prevent you from ever achieving the truly disastrous, unstable, dangerous things, or, actually, you kind of get the idea. So in fact, even just the language of constraints versus optimization objectives can help in moving away from a paradigm of some, objective optimization function that it's either in control in the sense that we're optimizing for this thing, or whether, we're talking about, what is just a sort of like safe system constraint set, and are we still within it, and are we far away from the edges? And maybe that's a very mathematical question, that what are the edges of this safe set? But there's an interesting thing that happens here in the boundary between formalism and realism, because you start having to create formalisms to represent the things that you care about that are real, in order to get algorithms to impose policies that actually protect you from the real states you don't want to be in.
It sounds like everything's getting a bit too real. So we've spoken a lot about realism, but we haven't really introduced it. So really introduced. We're getting real, and we're really introducing realism. Great. So this idea is kind of it's a bit more slippery than the others, in my opinion. Here's a nice short definition: that the objects can exist in a reality that's independent of our conceptual schemes, our perceptions, our languages, and our beliefs. So the thing exists out there. It doesn't really care what our systems of knowledge are, or our lenses, or our way of viewing the world. And you can apply this to almost anything, right? You can apply it to your brain, other people's brains, the temporal, the past and the future, mathematical entities, moral categories, the physical world, internal thoughts. And so one of the things that seems to come up time and again is that realists very often claim that the truth exists in this correspondence between cognitive representations and reality. And this is a bit like the kind of formalism-realism loop that we were touching on earlier. In that, whatever we believe now is only an approximation of reality, but that the accuracy and fullness of understanding can be improved. And so you can kind of see how formalism and realism can indeed would often coexist.
I think we need to introduce, I love this, what you just said, and we need to introduce a new word or a new between friction to understand kind of the difference between formalism and we see it in the crypto world. And we see it also in the legal system. You have lawyers who believe in kind of in the word that has been written, of law versus the spirit of the law, and we have the same thing in crypto. People who believe in the formalisms that have been defined in the early years of crypto versus the realists in crypto who try to create systems that are adaptive to what is really happening now and the needs of creating those Web3 networks based on the dynamics that we have today. And very often people who are prefer to stick to formalism is because they don't really like friction. Because realism means to be adaptive, agile, and be able to kind of have some tolerance for human friction. Because the process of redefining the formalisms to adjust them to a set of realities is not frictionless and requires time and effort and is not welcome by everyone.
It seems to me that the biggest challenge in both realism and formalism doesn't live in either concept, but in their relation to one another. In my experience, it's managing that relationship, whether it's observing the friction of adjusting the formalisms in response to real observations, or whether it's the boundaries of the formalisms in the sense that no formalism is sufficient to completely encapsulate the sort of, we'll say, the potential real that could come that you haven't observed and you don't know about yet, or just simply that exists in the sense of realism as it's presented here. So I don't know if people have thoughts, comments, but it's the edge between formalism and realism where most of the meat is, for me at least.
Yes, I see it the same way. Yeah.
And I wonder if we could even go as far, like I had this thought and we discussed it very briefly last week, if you even go as far to unpack a possible case study in the cryptocurrency world. So if we talk about friction, formalism and idealism, I'm usually thinking about the DAO. I'm usually thinking about Ethereum Classic and Ethereum. And then you can kind of, I think we should have I'd really like to have a discussion on where we think these different branches of the progeny from the fallout of the DAO situation, like where they live. And just for a bit of additional context, I know a lot of the Ethereum Classic people quite well. I was just emailing somebody at the Ethereum Classic Cooperative today. And what I see is something that philosophically or conceptually sits quite close to Bitcoin. Kind of the idea that the wisdom of the creator, or the guiding hand and the parameters and the specification that exists at the start, the canon, which should be followed as closely as possible. And so that seems like ETC is very much a formalist interpretation of how to run a Turing complete smart contract blockchain, whatever. And then, but there's an interesting thing to discuss about where we see Ethereum. Like, is Ethereum more on the idealism side, or is it more on the realism side? And I think maybe it's also changed over time. So I'd really love to hear people's thoughts on that.
So I think Ethereum is definitely more on the realism side, which is why a lot of people in the early Bitcoiners like to criticize Ethereum, and there are wars going on Twitter. It's like a drama, a soap opera. And it's, to me, it's very, and this is why I keep referring back to religion, because for me, this discussion between the Bitcoin and Bitcoin Classic, or Ethereum and Ethereum Classic, or Bitcoin versus Ethereum, is very much reminds me of the secessions in different religions, whether it's the Shiites against the Sunnis who started to reinterpret, or the Protestants that started to split off from the Catholics and create their own fork from and so we've always seen it, and you tend to have certain people in society who are more comfortable sticking to existing formalisms. This is why I wanted to introduce the concept of friction, because if you're friction averse, you prefer formalism. So it's important to understand human behavior in this whole thing. While I do fully agree with you, Michael, that it's not either or, and the in between is very important. But like on the edges, we have those who very much feel comfortable with formalisms, and then those who might want to change too often, right? And probably the truth is in between. And but this is where the ideological wars happen, and I would like to call it an ideological war.
You hit an important point.
Often.
I was going to say that I don't think that Ethereum is in the realism or the formalism category. I was going to put them in idealism. And that's not because of, and again, okay, let's go back to thinking of this as a triangle and imagining that you can be at different points. But I put a heavy weight on idealism because while I think their ideology espouses some of the concepts of realism, I don't consider their actual activities to be in the category that we would think of as real in the way that we've been discussing it. I think that they have some aspects of formalism, which comes from literally, we talked about this fork between the two. They're part of a broader genealogy that's very formalist. And then we took a break, and that break happened on what was essentially ideological lines. And then you could argue that then Ethereum Classic is further, its ideological position is far more formalist, and the Ethereum in Ethereum Foundation and Vitalik and whatnot is their ideological position is more on the realism side. But I would argue that in the grand scheme of things, we're still not necessarily in what I would consider overall healthy decompositions of the three. And that comes back to the institutions and the idea that none of these institutions are of questionable health. And that's not even to say that they're bad. They're young and maturing. Institutions tend to be things that we think of over long time periods. And I'm actually holding out a lot of my opinion of a lot of these institutions based on the actual real outcomes of those institutions in the world beyond themselves.
Yeah, I like your train of thought there, Z. And I didn't want to put my cards on the table immediately because I'm quite close to where you are. I think that Ethereum is more idealistic than realistic, and Ethereum Classic is very much more formalistic than anything else. Laura, I want to hear your thoughts. Yeah, go ahead, Sebnem.
No, just a side remark, then Cardano would be the formalistic fork of Ethereum.
Yeah, you could say that, I think. Yeah, Laura, I want to hear your thoughts on the Ethereum schism here.
No, actually, it's really, I didn't think about Ethereum in terms of an idealistic, Ethereum, not the classic, but in terms of an idealistic position. But it actually... quite interesting to think in those terms. And in relation to that, maybe a bit going back to the philosophical definition, I was wondering, within at least the concept of algorithmic realism, where is the place for emergence and perhaps arbitrariness as well? Because within the philosophical definition, right, when it says here that truth exists in a correspondence between cognitive representations and reality, these cognitive representations are not given ex nihilo, right? There is a process of formation of what these representations may come to be in relation to the reality, and truth is just an outcome of that in this sense. And so perhaps more broadly, how what is the place of emergence in particularly if we're talking about algorithmic realism, but perhaps also as a lens through which to see the evolution of the Ethereum ecosystem, how it came to be what it ended up being, and obviously considering also the role that arbitrary decision making, I guess, plays at that level of play.
Yeah, I think it's changing over time. Yeah, I think I could draw a token space of this thing, right? With this three, maybe not independent dimensions, but maybe as a triangle and things moving through space over time. So I've got next a little bit on the legal side on the paper. So where they talk about the shift in American legal thought from formalism to realism. And that I think is a nice kind of palate cleanser for us. And then I think we can really dive into some nitty gritty, and we can talk about the things that we came here for. So the shift from legal formalism to legal realism. The consensus around legal formalism was upended by an alternative mode of thought, legal realism, motivated by what they saw as the failure of legal reasoning, formal legal reasoning, to account for its real-world impacts. The legal realists challenged the formalist jurisprudence of forms, concepts, and rules. They believed that the inability of supposedly well-reasoned legal analysis to address social challenges such as poor working conditions and staggering inequality stemmed from the fact that context-specific realities and the social impact of laws had no place in formal legal analysis.
Yes.
If you wouldn't mind,
it maps really closely onto what we've been talking about. Yeah, go for it, Z.
Yeah, I was going to say, so this also mirrors closely with the sort of the second order cybernetics, which is this thing that happened in the 70s, where the sort of cybernetics thinking, which was about modeling social processes and human behavior and policies and whatnot, had this sort of staggering realization that the actual policies and decision makings and plannings and whatnot were then themselves part of the system, and that you simply couldn't do it in this, arguably purely formalistic framing, because you failed to acknowledge the extent to which the thing you were doing is part of the thing that you're describing while you're doing it. And this sort of second order feedback loop was the term, why the term was second order cybernetics. But I see this as a pattern that kind of emerges in a lot of fields as they start to recognize the practice of the field in its sort of abstracted form as being part of the real system that it realizes, and then like having to have a crisis of coming of age or maturation, where you go, oh no, I'm not this abstract formal thing, I'm that thing and the consequences of that thing, and sort of the closure of those relations.
I'm the well that I've been poisoning.
I would like to introduce an idea here. So the idealism is kind of the macro perspective of what we want to create, right? The formalism is how we create it, the micro perspective. And the realism is this where you adjust it on like this meso level where you adjust it.
I might consider flipping the last two, or certainly exploring the relations, but I think you might want to spend a bit more time explaining the micro, meso, macro in order to make it accessible to the audience.
Yeah, so I'm thinking, and now that I'm thinking, maybe the macro from the economics perspective is not quite fitting, but yeah.
Let's come back to it.
Too fast, but
yeah, let's come back to it.
Okay, maybe let's leave out the macro, meso, micro, but maybe the idealism is what we want to, like where we want to go. The formalism is how we want to do it. And the realism is the adjustment to the realities of this. So what you just referred to, second order cybernetics, the realities that we're seeing of how this mechanism or these procedures or these formalisms are working in reality. So we're adjusting, right?
I think I'm following. You're kind of causing me to want to jump to something of Wassim's in general, which is he talked at reference token space a few times, where he worked on creating some of these like sort of pseudo-subjective, pseudo-objective, quantitative measures of qualitative phenomena. And I want to use that as a reference for idealism, because I think, at least from my perspective, idealism is actually a little fuzzy in the sense that is that we actually need to reconcile the fact that our ideals are like the extreme points in these spaces, and that like our formalisms help us sort of describe spaces, and the ideals, at least again, I'm talking from my own experience, but I think of an ideal as being like these sort of discrete extreme points that help us reason about sort of richer spaces, which are, maybe the formalisms, but then that the actual real space is even richer than that. So there's a sort of continuum from idealized is the sort of most, simplified, and here's an extreme point in a space of possibilities. And then there's a formalism that's a description of this space. And then there's the real or realization of a thing, which is inherently richer. And so there's a real challenge in essentially almost like tuning your microscope to think in terms of the ideal, to think in terms of the formalism, or to think in terms of the real, which brings me back to this, well, you really can't do without all of them. To some extent, they're related to each other.
Mm.
Yes. And maybe so the ideal is kind of like yeah, I see this pyramid also. And the ideal is kind of maybe static, and the formalism and the ideal are more static, whereas the realism is more dynamic over time.
Yeah, let's unpack. So this slide that we just jumped to, because it had the token space thing on it, it has like a very, very brief encapsulation of the paper's take on algorithmic formalism. So I just want to make sure we didn't miss anything out before we... Yeah, no, that's fine. So the idea being that the algorithm is objective, and so this is a best thought of, I think, conceived initially when we talk about specifically learning algorithms like machine learning type systems. So the idea being with a formalist interpretation of an algorithm, that the algorithm itself is objective and neutral. It always, it's a good yardstick for reality. It's internalist, so everything that's inside the model can describe everything that's outside the model. The model knows best. And it's universalist, so like anything you throw at it, it can deal with. And the two memes at the bottom of the slide, I put in pretty much every talk I give. And so the top one is the middle one is the Scooby-Doo villain reveal. So the villain is always computers. And then we look behind the veil, and there's usually some humans that program the computers, or that use the computers, or that processed the outcomes of the computers, or that interpreted them. And then the XKCD cartoon on the right is just a nice snarky jibe about machine learning. So my brother is a machine learning engineer. So these are the sorts of things I like to send him when I poo-poo his career choices. So yeah.
I really want to say something about this. I apologize for me. So it's awesome. I want to go from the ideal to the formalism to the real with this in the simplest example I can. Binary classifier. The ideals are this notion that something is true or false. They're like these edgy, discrete, like we have this real, like, even if we don't know, we haven't got, like, the idealized points in a sense are true and false. And then you have a formalism that's, say, a machine learning model that we've constructed, which is much richer than this very static, true, false. And maybe it maps this space with a data model from features to labels, true or false, and maybe we train it with some records, and then the model actually has this richer thing. Usually you'll have a probability, which is like the likelihood that it's true or false, and then maybe there's a cutoff parameter that tells you whether to decide true or false. But even that is not as rich as reality, because it's no matter how much you try to train this thing, no matter how many data points you have, there's always going to be sort of more nuance, more context, more in reality than that thing can ever grok. And so if we use the binary classifier as our tool for describing, at least, again, the way I was framing it, the relation between the ideal, the formalism, and the real, we can kind of feel it in the true-false versus machine learned binary classifier, which is like in this sort of formalist bucket, versus the deep truth of, it may be highly contextualized, maybe to be determined, but the sort of completely uncapturable essence of the sense of whether that thing is true, or in the moment whether you made the right decision, or there's just more than you could ever get into the formalism.
Okay, I have a question for you that leads off this, Zagam. So Bayesian statistics, right? We're talking about machine learning. We're talking about so a lot of this is underpinned by Bayesian statistics, which is essentially the kind of counterpoint to frequentist statistics, it's pretty much more about the beliefs of people's beliefs of probabilities than the probabilities themselves. So where would you put that in our little matrix that we're constructing?
We're dealing with formalisms about formalisms. So we're constructing mathematical models that have underpinning assumptions, which are themselves built on other formalisms. So you get a sort of recursion in mathematical theory that says, here is something that I've constructed and it sort of works under these following assumptions. And then we start nesting these theorems in a sense. And we say, well, this has the following properties contingent on this other thing having the following properties. And in statistical machine learning methods in general, what you're doing is hiding assumptions about the nature of the statistics of the phenomena you're observing. And so I would argue that you're just kind of once removed. We're talking about something where the sort of some of the most critical assumptions are being made about the things that are once removed from the thing you're talking about. And this is what allows people to hide the subjectivity, because often the thing that you're talking about has got a very strong sort of you know, this is true because, and a lot of people behave, and like you get these ideological discourses about different objectivity of these solutions and these algorithms. And in my opinion, it's actually because we've hidden the assumptions through one or more layers of mathematical proof or theorem or statement about the properties of those algorithms, but that you've just really pushed them down I'll call it the epistemological supply chain.
And then like, define reality.
What was that?
Define reality. Like, how would you go about that?
Actually, I have an answer to this. You might not like it, but it's the closure over the set of models. So in a sense, models are incomplete by definition. You know, all models are wrong, some are useful, and you think in the sort of Wolfram computational irreducibility, these ideas that we have this infinite set of models that we just invent, and they are attempts to formalize our observations about the real, and if they're inherently incomplete, then reality is the closure of the ranges of those models.
Exactly.
So wait, so maybe the models are kind of a simulated realism.
Kind of, but there's an infinite number of them.
We are the components interpreting the simulators of reality.
Here's a really weird thing about this, though. Even if you tried to create a formalism that was able to describe models, and then you tried to like enumerate all of them in an attempt to sort of encapsulate this thing that we call reality, you would still fail because you're taking as an axiom, essentially, the incompleteness of those models. And since that thing is also a model that you've made from composing models, it's also incomplete. And so there's like a slackness even. You're saying that it's a closure over models, but it's not like a tight one. It's not where you can like take a limit and approach having it. Even that limit, because it's in its own set, it can't actually be in its closure. So there's some weird mathy shit going on if you start to try to use math for philosophical arguments about reality.
That's the mathiest part of computer science, and every computer scientist knows about computability theory, but they're like, that's theoretical computer science. Let's go program some web apps.
But realism is the complement. The realism is the complement of that discussion. It's not to say, oh, I have to worry about that computability theory. It's that I have to worry about the fact that theory tells me that there's this important real stuff I can't see.
So should we look at some critiques of formalism?
Like the mental model of a human just says, okay, can we just not talk about that? So well, yeah.
I mean, it's easier to shy away from the difficult, the difficult truths, right? So, I mean, I've got a slide with some critiques of algorithmic formalism, which I think is a nice segue into talking about focusing on realism. So, here's some critiques. One is that computer scientists should be attentive to the gulf between the abstractions of models and the complexity of the world. Leith called for computer scientists to replace computing formalism with sociological imagination. Algray decried the false precision of formalism as an extremely constricting cognitive style. And Langley noted the machine learning research has seen an increased emphasis on formalization and a bias against papers that do not include such formalistic treatments. And most recently, there's this new field of algorithmic fairness, which is highlighting really kind of starkly and quite brutally the limits of abstraction and formalism, and really underlining the need for this socio-technical stroke cyber-physical lens with which to regard these things.
I also have lots of things to say, but I'm gonna like shut up for a moment because I've been eating a lot of air.
And first a question. So just first a question then, because this is where I also want to hear that beyond things that we can automate, cyber-physical systems that from my point of view have always been just machine-made systems, where also the engineer of those literally, you know, doesn't take the human into the loop. But when you guys talk about cyber-physical systems or physical systems, you include the human with their minds and their social and political things going on as well, right?
I do personally. I can't speak for anyone else.
I take cyber-physical systems to include their closure over the human and institutional like decision-making apparatus that is fundamentally part of the of, again, the system that's evolving, that is the purpose of those infrastructures, so that they're meaningless without the closure over the individual human decision makers and the institutional decision making apparatus that sort of monitor, maintain, govern, and consume those infrastructures.
Laura, are you still there?
Yes, I am. I was still meditating on the incomputability and relation with reality. I think it was a really beautiful way of defining reality in this context. Yeah.
I like the pointing towards fairness, and I know that Zagum has been thinking about algorithmic fairness and bias recently as well. I recently watched a very nice conversation between Shafi Goldwasser and Guy Rothblum, who's an Israeli theoretical computer scientist, and really talking about all of the kind of the area, the locations in the computer science food chain where biases can creep in. So one of the examples he was talking about is, so he's working on a project where in coordination with a health institute, they're trying to analyze, study using machine learning type systems to get some kind of a predictive model for who's at risk from COVID-19. And they've got it's Israel, so they've got loads of health data on everybody, and they're trying to come up with some kind of way to guide healthcare policy in this particular time. And one of the really interesting points that he was making is that bias can creep in, or unfairness can creep in. There's so many different layers of this process. One of the ones that is quite interesting is if you think about, say, the demographic changes of a country over time, and that will affect your training set is your historical data, but then your historical demography may not be the same as your present day demography. And the kind of extreme example of this is, imagine a country where everybody's the same skin color, and then 20 years later everybody's not the same skin color, but you trained your model from the historical data, and every time it sees somebody that looks a bit different, it the red alarm goes off, and so you've got kind of is that easy?
So I think in this context we need to talk about assumptions, right, and governance, like who gets to decide how we write these algorithms. And by the way, because this is a salon, I'm gonna smoke now. I hope
you can do what you want.
Not gonna. Yes. So what are the assumptions upon which we build these algorithms, and who makes those assumptions, and who creates the models and implements the algorithms, and what type of governance process, because fairness is a function of who decides, right? Or what is fair. Fairness is a social consensus also. So, for example, one of the challenges to get less abstract, right? We're on a very abstract level, which I love. But in this particular sense, like writing and researching a lot about the Web3, I see that if we look at, for example, blockchain protocols or Web3 protocols as the constitutional foundations of this new Web3, right? Then now I lost my train of thought. What were we talking about? Okay. Fairness. So in democratic constitutions, at least, we have minority protections. I don't see where we have minority protection in blockchain protocols other than secession by hard fork. So I guess fairness is also, if we discuss fairness, we need to discuss whether the majority rules is not fair. This is something we've already come to a conclusion, at least for those who live in democratic countries and defend this value set, right?
Can I try something with this? I want to see what you guys think. But I'm going to try to use the idealism, the formalism, and the realism as a tool to describe at least my perception on fairness. So let's start with the idea that there's a bunch of ideal notions of fairness. So think of these as mathematical objective functions. We're not worried about yet whether they conflict with each other. We just say that they exist. They're ideals. This is fair if it gets a score of 1 on this measure over something. And then we have a sort of formalism where we can actually sort of pick what are mathematically sort of mixtures of these optimization objectives, where we not say, well, the best thing is the thing that scores the best on some, weighted mixture of these measures. But even that, as a formalism, has a gap in the sense that even if you solved that optimization problem perfectly with some kind of oracle, you would have a real gap in terms of who is serviced. There's someone who's always going to be sort of left sort of disadvantaged in some form, or at least perceive themselves as being disadvantaged by this system. And I view this as a very, very abstract generalization of like an Arrow's theorem, which has to do with fairness in voting systems. But I think it comes from something very primitive, which is that there are a bunch of these ideals that we can create that describe fairness, and that we're at best picking picking a mixture, and then even if you get a solution that's optimal in the sense of that objective, it's necessarily got a gap away from sort of any real, fairness, that it's still out of reach. And
yes,
I wonder
and we have resolved this. We have resolved this with the judicial system, and Justitia is representative for the balance. This is why in our nation-state structures, we have a judicial system to balance out which cannot be formalized sufficiently. And so if we talk about algorithms, we need to talk about, and maybe that would be a topic for next salon, kind of algorithmic judicial systems, or probably not the right word, but this is where we need human discretion, or maybe in a future algorithmic discretion, if you have different types of intelligent algorithms deciding upon all these things that you cannot predefine.
So this is like dispute resolution,
right? Yeah,
like dispute resolution mechanisms. This is what we're talking about here.
Yes, dispute resolution mechanisms. The judiciary, that's the whole point of having a judiciary system in society, is to resolve this unresolvable problem in predefining everything.
But isn't that, I was going to say, but isn't that like this, the judicial system, like as you're defining, isn't that kind of like similar to perhaps the formalist definition of fairness that Michael was referring to? Like, it seems to me that in reality, it's there's always those gaps or those frictions within, say, these formal systems that could be like the judicial system or formalized dispute resolution system versus, on the other hand, there's idealized notions of fairness versus, at the end of the day, someone who's still going to be, upset by some kind of, resolution. I'm even wondering whether the notion of fairness, it's per se like quite idealistic, or I find it really, I don't know, maybe I'm just channeling my Nietzschean side here, but I'm even wondering whether it's realistic to think in terms of fairness at a large scale.
This is the point. This is the point I really wanted to get to, Laura. Thank you for going there. The reason I went back to this token space slide and I put the pointer over this side, it's probably a bit too small to read, but this is the point I was making with token space, is where you kind of, as you construct the conceptual framework, you choose where you lie between subjectivity and objectivity. But if you go all the way to objectivity, if you try to parameterize fairness in a formal sense, then you end up being susceptible to what economists call Goodhart's law. The idea being that if a measure becomes, if a metric becomes a measure, then it becomes an optimization target, and it will be gamed. Like there will be an incentive to gain or optimize for that thing. And if your thing that you're optimizing for is fairness, then you're going to make the most goddamn fair-looking algorithm that has ever existed. But just underneath all the heuristics that everyone's measuring, it's probably going to look different.
And I think what's really interesting about this is that I think we are starting to, I hate to say it, but we're starting to get what I would call negative results in the mathematical sense, but maybe they're very positive, which is we're getting, incompleteness results. We're getting conclusions that say some things are not like that they don't have answers. The answer is not true or false. The answer is there's no answer. And it's a tough thing because it kind of forces you to sort of, I don't know, like advance the way that you think and the patterns that you are willing to consider. And I think that, at least again, I'm going to try to use the sort of mixture of formalism and realism that comes from my field of sort of automation and mathematical like control theory stuff, is that fundamentally we reconcile with the concepts of observability and controllability, which result in, which are, I'll start by defining them. Controllability is what you can actually decide over, what changes you can manifest, and observability is like what you can actually observe and see. And in a world that has incomplete observability and incomplete controllability and many agents and processes evolving over time, there's actually a whole lot of stuff you can't do and you can't know. And like in some ways, you know, as we move forward with algorithmic realism, we just have to be a little bit better at using assumptions in our designs, in our validations, in our dispute resolutions, in our whatever human or machine decision-making procedures that we embed in our institutions, to just like have as part of our value system, of our shared narrative, our joint systems of how we see and talk about the world, these like more complete notions of incompleteness.
Yeah, more explicit maybe even. So if you stay on this one, it was funny because I didn't see it as a matrix, but as layers, and with the tooling and the technological advancement and even awareness as humans as we have now, and luxury to think about these things, we can basically try to squeeze out as much as unspoken or unrealized or unrecognized subjectivity that is there. You know, what you say is underneath, what is underneath these systems or these objectives. So what we have is we can we can have quantitative data, we can source qualitative data, you know, bringing in the subjectivity, even not, you know, fully into your algorithms, but at least out there on the table. And we can see whether what is objectively wanted or good, or at least stated, is wanted by the most or not. So this whole tokenized systems of curation, I think are very exciting because that they give us a scale in this multi-dimensional space. And at the first time, this is literally the first time where you can really have a cybernetics 2.0, where you can make it so accessible that anyone, without knowing Latin or mathematics, can actually reason or at least know, right? At the moment, we are in a very strange in-between place where, you know, we cannot tell between news and fake news, and people are being manipulated, but the same infrastructure and tooling is almost there to be able to really be useful for every individual to at least know where they are and where we are as a collective and as an individual in that system, and literally fed by any data that we can get from these cyber-physical and social system.
It sounds like we're almost ready to move to realism. Z, jump in before we.
There's a concept that I think is super critical that we're kind of brushing against, which is it's rigor. And I want to talk about rigor in the non-quantitative sense. I think most people really get quantitative rigor, but in the sense of more broadly, including non-quantitative, I strongly associate rigor with reproducibility of lines of reasoning, which just means that you need to have all of your assumptions and even your assumptions about models, or this stuff that we're saying is implicit subjective choice. When you start to like lay out all of the context, including whether it's the methods of data collection, or whether it's the assumptions that you made in the modeling of something, or it's like this broad spectrum of inputs that are often hidden, rigor is actually about making those as so explicit as to ensure that if someone comes to your conclusions later, the sort of whole logical supply chain is made transparent to them. And I think that this happens pretty naturally, and the ways of doing it in a quantitative environment are, are increasingly common and discussed. And I think that it happens in the social sciences actually almost in an older way, in that good research is just recognized and valued for that sort of assumption completeness, and the fact that someone who disagrees with you can still trace your entire argument, and maybe even take parts of it and use them, but let go of some of the assumptions you disagree with. And so as we move into this sort of hybridized paradigm where we have to talk about the social sciencey and sort of things that are a bit more qualitative, and combine it with things that are quantitative or, maybe perceived as objective, that they marry on this line of rigor. And the key is that rigor isn't necessarily about quantitative or non-quantitative. It's about the extent to which the chain of logic is reproducible. And then you can evaluate the conclusion a little bit, if you choose to, I suppose, more completely, like it was predicated on these things. And it makes it harder to use them out of context too.
Are you talking about version controlled epistemology here, Z?
I guess kind of. I don't know. Well, all I'm really trying to do is the moment is reintroduce and maybe expand the concept of the word rigor to help us with our realism.
What you're describing is this kind of rigor is applied or should be applied in a judiciary system, right? So a judge is supposed to apply that rigor deriving from the constitutional laws, the Constitution and the laws, and make a rigorous judgment in and to resolve a certain dispute, right? So I agree. Yeah.
I think it holds in both that case and in the case of choosing a point in this formalist space. So if we go back to, I use a formalism to describe the design space, but I know that my design becomes part of a real system and therefore has inherent gaps, then choosing the approximation and even choosing how to choose the approximation that I impose on others essentially is itself a task that has to be done in this rigorous way. And although I think we probably do it with these kinds of dispute resolutions, at least in theory, in real life today, one might argue that this thinking is not applied to algorithmic design choices in a large part because we are missing the algorithmic realism aspects required to even differentiate the choices from each other and to acknowledge that, like, which assumptions are implicit, and also acknowledge that there's an imperfection in any choice.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good setup for us to move to, finally, algorithmic realism. So as it's laid out in the paper, this is pretty much what they, the précis of what they lay out. So the idea being the proposed principles of the algorithmic realism that's envisaged by Green and Viljoen. These aspirational attributes counter the orientations of algorithmic formalism, with particular attention to preventing and or mitigating the harms it can produce. As the case of legal thought demonstrates, such a shift can productively enhance a discipline's epistemic and methodological ability to engage with the social. While no mode of reasoning can avoid imposing its logic on the world, self-conscious modes can expand their internal logic to explicitly reason about their effects in the world. And really they break it down into kind of three macro categories, which they go through quite a lot in the paper, and we're just going to take the TLDR here. And this is essentially the political, because it's always political, the porous, because nothing is perfect. These things are always leaky and messy. And contextual, so the situational awareness in which the implementation of the algorithm exists. And we can just compare that back to what we were talking about in algorithmic formalism, where the primary attributes seem to be the objectivity, neutrality, internalism, and universalism.
So I love where we landed.
You want to go? Yeah.
Sorry, but exactly.
There is not much more to add.
Sorry. Shall I leave you?
Well, the paper basically, you should go, Shebnem, because like the next part is basically their call for action. I think we will have something to discuss there.
Okay, now I'm ready for action.
Let's roll. Okay.
What we're seeing, or what we have now, is no. You can please go back. So this contextual
I'm gonna go back.
and situational awareness is what we have literally on the table. This is what we can use. These are the systems we're going to have built with contextual and situational awareness. Like, this is what I have in my tool belt. What is really uncomfortable is saying that algorithms are always political. I think this is what the Ethereum guys are really comfortable with, because they're coming from this political economy region, I believe. But for a software engineer or a programmer, it's, why? It's a little bit a big burden. So in a sense, if we had for the first 2 points, I mean, the second point we can even deal with, it must be an adaptive system if it's imperfect. And as soon as we have the awareness of a bump on the road, we can adapt. But this political thing, we need tools to deal with that uncomfortable truth. So how should I deal with the algorithms being political? How should I deal with the reality that I'm an interventionist, although I thought of myself just writing nice programs and being, what could go wrong? And now you're saying basically a lot of things go wrong as soon as you're intervening with social systems. And this is, I want to come back to Zörgam Strigor. Literally every other profession that deals with humans has this rigor in an oath. And that's something I would like to know from you guys, yes, this oath, what does it do with the engineer or the surgeon? Is it just the mental programming that from there on you just have this rigor and you cannot just...
No, it's a separation of expertises. So like we use engineering, let's use civil engineering to building bridges as a simple example. In most of the modern world, building a bridge is inherently political. Someone, and in part because the funding and the labor comes from, local or potentially even national governments. But that set aside, the act of building a bridge is going to fundamentally change the nature of a social system. Although it is a physical task to construct it, and it is a formalism task to design it, and there's like all sorts of interesting things here. Ultimately, I would argue that there's a separation but a relationship between the layers of who decides that a bridge needs to be built, who decides how much is going to be spent, and how many lanes it's going to have as a result of what impact that's going to have on people isn't actually the same as the people who design the bridge, which is certainly not the same as the people who actually build the bridge. And there's some separations there that speak to the fact that the expertise required to do these things are different, and the frictions that you're talking about. The real truth about software development that I think is a hard truth is that you have to likely specialize between being someone who's going to deeply engage in the question of the assumptions and the impacts on people, and being someone who's putting their headphones on and writing code to spec. Because at the end of the day, you're actually separating the roles of the political decision makers deciding to fund and build the bridge for the people's well-being, the engineers that design and validate the designs, that they meet the needs of the humans, provide specifications to construction teams of various specializations that are then going to build it, and the people who also maintain it, govern, deal with end of life. There's a pretty deep social science tradition in engineering as a discipline, and I think that we have to bring it into our algorithms practice in order to manage these layers, and not say, hey, software engineer, you have to do all these things. You just need to be in a team or in an environment that it values all of these things and make sure that they're all covered by someone.
And I think the reason why we might not have the same amount of separation of powers and rigor in software engineering is because it's still a relatively new discipline, and we're we're learning as collectively as things go wrong from like what we can see, for example, Cambridge Analytica files, Facebook, etc. While a few people have seen these things coming, people who were close to understanding, you know, how the internet works, etc. But on a collective level, humanity needed those massive data breaches, to now understand that we have a problem and we need a different type of rigor and discourse when building these kind of, for example, algorithms.
So to own my own assumptions, though, to be clear, I took a very like statist example, one where there's a sort of paternalistic political entity of some kind. And one of the things that's also different about Web3 is that these loops are tighter, which is one of the reasons, again, why we have, you know, developers in some cases being wedged into these political decision-making roles, even sometimes without realizing that they're making subjective choices that are performative and thus political. And so one of the things that's going to happen is not to recreate the, say, governance pyramid that you see in a sort of state, but actually to examine what kind of governance loops exist between the sort of participants in these infrastructures, the developers and you know, constructors and maintainers of these things, the designers, and then the sort of, again, the people who are sitting in this level of, you know, capturing and identifying these subjective choices and questioning them and sort of pushing for, you know, maybe agitating for change or whatnot. And so all of the roles end up getting filled, but maybe the way that they relate to each other doesn't match one-to-one with what we do in sort of this engineering disciplines that are anchored in what is essentially state sovereignty.
Yeah. So for example, you cannot make software secure, right? You can just see how it breaks and then fix it. So the second point, that it's imperfect, leaky, and it needs to adapt and improved or fixed. And literally putting all three together, I think we will need, yes, rigor, but we will also need to have that embedded into this whole development process, and not just, I don't think that it will work, you know, just give me my requirements and then I go and build it, and we see when it's deployed what's going to happen, and someone up there decides. Because I think the reason that it's political, we also need to somehow bring in the user of the system to be part of those decisions. And I'm not saying democratizing software development, but in a sense that the users who are affected by the decisions made by programmers or developers of these digital systems get to at least know and evaluate what it does to their livelihood and lives.
What you want is not to define fairness, but to have an emergent, real sense of fairness.
So, I mean, there's an interesting parallel between what Shebnam was talking about just there, with like bringing the user into the system, and like a kind of slightly unrelated thought where I was trying to find other kinds of competing paradigms through history that you might be able to tag or to characterize with this kind of idealism, formalism, and realism lens. And the one that I stumbled across because of my training is quantum mechanics. So one of the first schools of quantum mechanics that was tremendously successful in predicting some, using formalism to predict some aspects of the world around it was what's called the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. And the way that the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics managed to produce some like neat closed form mathematical relationships, which people are still using today, is it pushed the user, the observer of the quantum thing, out of the system. Now, if you've read even more than a few tweets about quantum mechanics, you will be like pretty certain that the observer, there's a thing called the observer effect, right? The observer is like the trigger that determines the collapse of a superposition into an observable outcome. And so pushing the user out of the system seems like this kind of crazy extreme formalism. And you can balance that with the von Neumann interpretation, which is much harder to get anything done with in terms of like quantitatively or mathematically speaking, formally speaking. But by bringing the observer back into the system, it becomes much more of a realist interpretation. And the other thing I was just thinking about when we were talking about bridges is that, like, the bridges we've got today, like, we've had hundreds of years of engineering, but at some point somebody will have done their engineering calculations, built a bridge, not taking into account the change in temperature from summer to winter, or changing humidity, or that this material does this in certain conditions. And isn't not that the case that the longest bridge in the world, which connects Hong Kong, Shenzhen, and Zhuhai, they had to rebuild it halfway through because they did their sums wrong. So, like, even something like bridge building, which is a fairly, like, I suppose, established discipline, we can still fall down formalist traps.
Yeah. Oh, and actually, when you bring up the bridge example with the materials, that's an example I frequently use for the presence of the sort of situational awareness, even in physical things, where the abstraction was still just a design on paper, but the real thing has actual adaptive materials in it in order to make it able to sort of stand through things like temperature cycles. And so, you know, the reason I like the bridge examples is it's actually amazing how much the imperfection of the engineering abstraction, potentially multiple layers of them, designs that sort of all the way from I drew a line on a map to, hey, let's put it here, to you know, plans at the large scale, to subsystems, to like all the way down through the end of the what I'll call the formalist section, which is the writing of plans and approving of plans. And then the actual real bridge is a completely different thing. And the you know, the map isn't the territory, you know, this idea that the representation isn't the thing is actually really critical aspect of this imperfect and leaky thing. And it's actually kind of amazing how tightly related the political, the porous, and the contextual bullet points are, because it's political because it's porous. Because it's porous, there's a sort of imperfection in the representation. I can't give you the real thing and say, is it okay if we do this? I can only choose a representation, and the representation influences the decision. It influences the perception. So you're like, okay, well, we made the decision based on what you showed me. What you showed me wasn't the real thing. It was a representation. Now I can mislead you. Now I'm making subjective choices. So you get the sort of political from the porous. But then when you go from the abstraction or the sort of formalist representation of the engineering plans to the real bridge, you actually have to close this gap. And in some of that, it's going to happen through things that are inherently, they have to be sort of inherently real in the way these materials are real, because it doesn't matter whether you said that the material would adapt to temperature. What matters is whether it really did, and did the bridge crack, and did it fall down? Yes or no? Anyway, so.
Yeah, there's one more slide which basically wraps up the paper, and then I think we can go a bit more free form, and you know, until we fall asleep or we decide to quit. We've been going for quite a while now, so yes, let's do this, because this is kind of their TLDR, their next steps in the call for action. So as computer science increasingly engages with social and political contexts, the field has come up against the limits of algorithmic thinking. Computer science lacks the language and the methods to fully recognize, reason about, and evaluate the social aspects and impacts of algorithmic interventions. In turn, even well-intentioned algorithmic interventions are at risk of producing social harms. Enabling computer science to responsibly navigate its social effects requires several steps. Number one, diagnosing the attributes of algorithmic thinking and how those attributes lead to harm. Two, evaluating the potential and limits of current efforts to reform algorithms and the systems that they're applied within. Three, describing how the field can expand its epistemic and methodological boundaries. And finally, articulating the tenets of a computer science practice that has evolved based on the concerns raised by affected communities and disciplines, such as science and technology studies, or these kind of ethics, tech and society.
Yeah, I think this is complete, but the last point lacks. So when creating algorithms, we have to move away from this notion or thinking that we need computer scientists only to build algorithms. So what we need, because these algorithms are the socioeconomical layer upon which we interact, we need to understand that we need actually multidisciplinary teams. from different walks of, with different backgrounds, various social science backgrounds, economics, legal sciences, et cetera, to build these algorithms. They are then put into like the process of formalizing the algorithm. In the last step is done by the computer scientist, but while modeling and conceptualizing it, we need interdisciplinary teams. And as long as we have 100% computer scientists building algorithms, we will build the wrong algorithms. I guess this is my call to action.
Yeah. To be fair to the authors, they're not pure computer scientists themselves. They're actually kind of Berkman crowd. So they are kind of already interdisciplinary crowd. But I think that they're framing this is a call to arms mainly to the existing corpus of people working on algorithms, which is mostly computer scientists. So I suppose you have to start there. And like obviously what you do, Sherman, in Vienna, and what we do through Crypto Economic Systems is speaking to that. We're trying to bring people in from outside, and we're trying to broaden the debate.
I'm stressing this because I think that we need to stress this. Both in Europe and at MIT. I think there is a growing understanding, fortunately, that we need more people with various backgrounds when creating these algorithms, but very often the notion is still like, okay, we need one lawyer and maybe one social scientist, when in fact it should be well divided depending on what you're building, obviously, like into 1/4 of your team as a computer scientist, let's say, and then you have 1/4 of your team with some kind of legal background, etc., and then some economists, depending on what you're building, right? But not just like, very often I see that people are trying to build crypto economic systems, and now they understand, oh, we need an economist, and then they want to hire one economist, when in fact they would need 100 in a team of 200.
Or that the economic question or the legal question is not even well posed, right? So part of the reason you need more is that the implied economic question or the implied, say, whatever other field question has been written in the lens of computer science because of this that you've described. And in fact, it's not just that it needs, oh, I need someone to solve this for me. It's that you need to have that perspective well enough captured in your whole problem and solution framing effort, that the whole system is well posed, and that the various social and technical elements can be achieved. Actually, Wasim, if you wouldn't mind, the diagram that popped up. So this is something that comes from this field that we've referred to a couple times called cyber physical systems, has its own strengths and weaknesses, but I call it to attention here on at least on the grounds that I think that computer science isn't the only field sort of pushing along this, what I'll call this boundary. I think that there's a very strong need for us to continue to recognize the sort of effects of that, you know, what I called earlier, this maturation, where you go through realizing that you are not a closed system, that what you're designing is part of something part of something real, part of something that is beyond the scope that of your formalism. And how do we contend with that in practice, not just how do we contend with that in theory? And so I tend to harken back to CPS and this diagram from Berkeley, which actually maps out this concept of a cyber physical system, which is essentially algorithmic decision making embedded with physical and social systems. To Shebnem's point earlier, more focus on the physical than on the social. So there's a need to push in the direction that Sherman is talking about. But I will highlight this middle orange and yellow, which is essentially how do we deal with this? And the answer, at least from my part, is, you know, not purely technological, but like the improvement of the methodology and the tools, and that methodology and tooling can include how to break the problem down and make sure we've checked different stakeholder groups and we've checked for different expertise types. And, you know, going back to our earlier discussion about these different lenses, the methodology can actually call for more than one lens. And in a sort of, again, at least in this engineering discipline that I'm from, we have systems engineers who are sort of like these lateral generalists whose job is synthesis across specific domains of expertise. And while that may be more, mechanical, electrical, computer, power system, whatever, as we move towards these interdisciplinary, we'll call them engineering design efforts for public infrastructures, economic, political, et cetera, that there's just more domains of knowledge, and that we need to be able to continue to fill in this design tools and design methodology and maintenance tools and governance tools that actually respect the interdisciplinarity, but also that means kind of creating new shared languages and new sort of patterns where we can say, hey, let's talk about how institutions and constitutions and code are actually related to each other in many different versions of this. So we start to have shared language between our economists, our legal experts, our computer scientists, our, control systems engineers, say, and whatever else that we discover is actually required in our set of expertises in order to drive real results that we then can look at the outcomes and say, again, who is we? I guess that's a question itself, but that one can look at and feel good about what has been accomplished. And I'm going to end that with, I have a really hard time with who is we, who decides, or how do we measure whether it was successful. And I think one thing I really like is the application of variations of Rawls' veil of ignorance, where essentially if you're examining a system, you have to relinquish your perspective as yourself, and actually every perspective that you can define, you can sort of ask yourself whether or not the system is operating or is in a state or has a process which you would consider acceptable to you, even if you are in any one of the roles that you've defined.
Nice. Sorry, Laura, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that perhaps that defining the we is the political question of the algorithmic realism.
Yeah.
I think.
Mm.
And maybe an analogy to sorry. Just as a food for thought, I think humans tend to stylize or idealize technology when they discover new technology, and we can see it by the way how we build cities, right? So once we invented the car as a vehicle, we started to make more space for the car than for pedestrians or people, people using bicycles and walking. And so the car took a lot of space, and people who were designing cities, so it's only the last maybe 10, maximum 20 years that we're seeing more a human-centric approach to, or nature-centric approach to building cities. So I think there is a lot we can learn from mistakes we've made with old technology when we just discovered building bridges and cars, and now we're trying to redefine this. So it's not a computer science problem only. It's generally a technology cycle process.
You said the magic word, cycles and technology. So I'm going to segue onto, I'm on the wrong computer. There we go. This one. I found this cool old paper. It's 40 years old, which is trying to do what seems like it's trying to set the narrative along this line from formalism to realism, looking at kind of different the diagrams are quite small, but you can see them in the low resolution in the paper. But the idea being that these are kind of flowcharts representing algorithms or computer programs, you could say. And the more complicated they get as you go from left to right, the more feedback, or the more iteration, or the more learning, or the more consideration of inputs is taking place. And so I don't want to go too far down the road of this paper, but they pulled out these interesting laws of program evolution on the right, which, just to list them, that the program is evolving, it's continually changing, it's increasing in complexity. It's subject to dynamics which makes the process and hence measures of global project and system attributes self-regulating with determinable trends and invariances. There's conservation of organizational stability, and there's a conservation of familiarity. So I think there's a lot of parallels between what this paper was trying to get at. This was kind of more of a opinion piece, almost like an op-ed in the IEEE. Yeah, go ahead.
I have to look it up, but it sounds still like they're looking at the outcome as the software product that comes out of the process. Mm-hmm. But what we have now with this, for example, the cyber-physical system map is that the concept developers recognize that there is this feedback system, and literally it says possibly with humans in the loop, economics in the loop, and environmentals in the loop. And this is where this whole complexity and emergence comes from, right?
I mean, so I think this is a formalist take that wants to be realism. It wants to move towards realism, but it's not ready. It's not there yet.
Yeah, but we're 40 years beyond, so that's good where we're at, I guess. And the second thing that was, I think, on the slide before, but this is literally how I came into this discussion, was when I was figuring out, the Crypto Economics Foundation and this Crypto Economics flower with the petals that are different disciplines. And I was like, okay, I got everything figured out. Even though it would cost millions to have such a multidisciplinary field, at least I know who I can call upon in our token engineering ecosystem, except law and ethics. So this is literally, I was like, okay, how do we get those people into the process? Are there tools? How can we create, or is there a common language that I don't know yet, but others in this discipline?
There is no common language. This is why I think in our paper, Zarkem and I wrote this, the same paper with the petals. We said that what you need for interdisciplinary teams to work together is this ramp-up process where you have a Rosetta Stone, where you try to find a common ground and map the different vocabulary that mean the same thing, but you use different words to refer to the same thing in different disciplines. This is why people tend to dislike working in interdisciplinary teams, because it's time intense, especially in the beginning. But once you dedicate to this effort, I think our economic system, but also our academic system, is not built around interdisciplinarity. So I think we need to make this effort, and it takes time.
I have literally a whole... Yeah, I have literally a whole talk about all of this stuff. I'm just trying to find one of my favorite slides to drop in that we can have a joke about. But I mean, that tells you how early we are in this whole thing. That we're having trouble, even people that know each other having trouble to communicate.
Listen, this is literally when you said, hey, this is the answer, algorithmic realism, and you slap the paper and I look at it, it was just published a month ago. I'm like, come on. There are no answers, so we have to kind of live with that and build in between.
The answer is that there's no answers.
So one question I do have, and this is maybe an outlook or maybe the mindset that I would take with me still, is I was asking for a legal, ethical opinion or a teammate, right? But maybe since the users are going to be affected directly and actually they should be part of this, what if there is this consent? Literally, we have the system that can be grasped, how it will affect my life as a user, as a citizen, and I can consent or not. Is this enough, or do we really need this jurisdictional or jurisdictional system?
But is the consent informed? Like, can we be sure that the consent is informed? If somebody consents without having a full view of information, is that really meaningful? And I think that's one of the biggest problems that we've got, is that, we have all this there's so many moving parts, everything's so complicated here. We're having trouble talking to each other, even though we know each other and we're interested in similar things, and we've had conversations like this before. And so when you widen this thing out, I think there's just still such a chasm, and that's kind of why I made this silly slide. Yeah.
This is the inherent the inherent politics in all of the engineering examples, though, regardless of what the designed human-facing thing is, because at least as I see it, the technology implies an inherent under-the-hood complexity. So you can't have the answer be, well, everyone always has to evaluate all of the complexities from first principles with all of the expertise required to make a decision on their own behalf, because that's simply not possible. And so the moment you accept that, you have these layers of abstraction that exist for the purpose of managing complexity and getting the benefits of technology without having the explicit expertise to consent. You're depending on information or decisions that are made by others, and in a sense owning the responsibility, or sort of being conscious about who we're giving the rights and how we're managing the rights of people to make subjective choices on behalf of the their broader perception of what is good, which is also subjective, is really just the notion of engineering manages the complexity of technology. So it's political because it's reducing. It's saying, don't worry about the minutia. It's safe because I certified it, because I'm licensed by this body, or any other rights management regime that is essentially in, maybe less status and maybe more decentralized, but a rights management regime from which I can sort of stand up and say, I say that, like, I made the choices and I made them with this rigorous procedure, and you should, trust that this is safe, at least to the extent that it has these properties. And, like, again, owning the fact that I had to make subjective design choices and I had to make political choices about what to prioritize and all that messy shit that comes in when you acknowledge the real. But that doesn't mean that we want to suddenly revert to everyone has to know everything and make every assessment on their own, because that's also not real.
But this, again, has already been discussed in the social sciences field. I mean, this is why we have representative democracy, because we don't have the mental transaction costs are too high. The capacity to decide, over each and every single engineering step, even if we have the knowledge, the expertise, right? So this is why we delegate these decision-making processes to people who A, have the expertise, B, have the knowledge, and we can, technology can provide us more transparent tools and reduce this principal-agent dilemma of institutionalizing decision-making processes. And it can also allow us more fluid decision-making processes, more kind of liquid democracy approaches to decision-making. But it's just not realistic to...
Well, to tie a bow on that, though, the notion of representative democracy is a sort of ideal, a particular set of policies through which we elect specific people is a kind of formalism, and then a realization of that is a specific instance of representatives making decisions. And as we well know from the current state of reality, the idealized representative democracy, the formal systems that we put in place to sort of govern that, and the actual decisions and outcomes we get really don't line up nice.
Yeah, but these are systems we created maybe in the 15th, 16th century. So the democracies that we live in today have been conceptualized by the likes of Montesquieu and John Locke, and they lived in the 15th, 16th century. So that was, and the printing press back then was just invented. So one of the fundamental flaws of our, I would say, operating system of our society is that it's outdated. So I think that with this with the advent of the internet, but especially with what we're seeing now in this Web3, we have this time frame. And I guess this is why I've been like working so hard and so fast, because I know that the window, time frame of defining the initial kind of conditions of how we create these systems is quite short, because once we created these initial conditions, and if we do it in the same closed kind of siloed mentalities with which we have created the previous iterations of the internet, or how we've operated our economic systems throughout the 20th century, I think we need to transcend this knowledge, right? But we have this opportunity to reinvent the operating system, and our operating system so far has been constitutionalized nation states, and their operating system is the constitution. And upon this constitutions, we built the laws, and they've been helping. They've been paving the way for us to be able to govern ourselves, and to. In the end, we should be the sovereigns over the decisions that are made, but we delegate it in a way. And by the way, Montesquieu, back in there is this writing. I have to. He in the 16th century, he already, as he was outlining how democratic systems could work and representative democracy could potentially work, he was already criticizing that in the larger the society is, the larger group of people will that is represented by representatives, the more likely a set of aristocratic elite that is very detached from the sovereigns tries to reign. So he basically predicted this detachment that we're seeing now from the political elite, from the sovereigns they're supposed to reign. So he already predicted that before. And I think we can now use technology to defragment these huge systems, potentially. Plus, I think we can use this technological layer as an operating system, a governance system, where we belong to various sets. It's opt-in, to answer your question, Shebnem. Up until now, I was born into, like coerced into the nation I was born into by chance, right? I didn't select it. And I can try to immigrate to another country. I might do that once in my lifetime. It comes at high kind of opportunity costs, social costs, etc. I probably won't do it twice. And the European Union, we're a little bit more privileged now. There is more freedom of movement to migrate from A to B. But in the internet, when we look at these Web3 networks, we will be able to be kind of citizen consumers of various networks, and we can opt into the network we think is well aligned with us. So I think in a way, it's more decentralized because we can be members of the type of networks we choose to be members of.
So what I wanted to say actually though was just in terms of this broader Salon's topic in you know the formalism, the realism, and the idealism, that one thing that I really like is that we can actually have conversations about the kinds of systems, and I'm going to call them the procedures or algorithms, right? The procedure of a representative democracy versus the system versus the sort of realization of that system. There's like room for us to actually use historical antecedents to discuss both our lenses and what our lenses can tell us about what we're designing by saying, okay, like what was the idealized form and the criticisms that could be levied just from turning over the idealized form and playing with it. And then you have slightly richer, like formalistic representations of systems through which you might do mathematical analysis and simulations and things using modern technology. But then there's still this gap to the realization, which necessitates this feedback loop through governance. And, one could start to say, like, even though things are so different in the terms of the operating system or the technological substrate, there's some aspects of how the lenses interplay that we could actually carry forward from historical antecedents, and maybe gives ourselves a little bit more maybe more rigorous methodology in these reconsiderations of both of institutions, of governance processes, and and of algorithms, where we actually, again, we don't necessarily take the wholeheartedly or take the idealized idealism or the idealized realism or the idealized formalism, but actually just take those points as lenses and use them together to maybe form something that we can simultaneously think about the past and the present and the future without putting them into too much conflict. Like we've reconciled them, again, not perfectly, but enough to draw inferences.
And the advantage we have today is that we have we solved the computability problem. Plus, we have we can have much more data-driven decision making, as opposed to how these governance systems were kind of created when they were created in the 16th century. They didn't have those data-driven kind of.
Data-driven suffers from the same thing, and I think a lot of people idealize the notion of data-driven because real data comes off of measurements. Measurements have embedded assumptions about the underlying physical process models or social process models, and so there's actually a full level of what's the idealized notion, like the ideal sensor, versus the actual formal model of the sensor, versus the real data that's thrown off by the sensor. And actually managing the relations conceptually is also critical, even just to manage quote unquote data driven.
Of course.
I feel like, can we draw a line? Can we draw a line, guys? Because we've been on this particular topic for quite a while. And I've got like one more thing I'd like to bring up, and then I think we can open up the floor for final discussion and then wrap it up, because it's getting close to our bedtimes in Europe. But before I do that, Laura, you haven't said much recently. Is there anything you wanna say on this on the topic of the cyber-physical and the feedback loops?
No, not much. I've been enjoying a lot the conversation, and and reflecting back on some of the things that we were talking about before, like also in terms of, I think, having these three lenses, the idealist, the formalist, and the realist kind of perspective, maybe also help us to, delineate or define again what can be to an extent formalized or computed or algorithmicized, and what perhaps it's just cannot, but having a better idea of that, and perhaps begin asking different kinds of questions, so for instance the question of how can the system become adaptive? Some of the things that we were discussing before, thinking again of the version controlling, perhaps, or a certain revisability of a system, on the basis of, particularly if you are talking about, legal systems, I guess, or political system or democracy, these very big and very rich concepts, but then begin thinking, we don't know exactly what would a fair or a just system look like, but we can begin thinking maybe how can we think about how to adjust the rules as we go forward and we begin understanding what works and what doesn't. I don't know, I guess these are other questions that were coming up as I was hearing,
Always more questions. They're bringing more questions. Yeah. So I was just wasting time, being unproductive at the weekend, listening to an economist friend of mine argue with an accelerationist philosopher, and they started attacking each other with citations and papers. And this paper is one that was in the same edition as the one that they were arguing over. So this is an old theoretical computer science paper from a special issue on computational paradigms from Nature. And so this is like the biological side, which maybe we haven't looked at so much. And so the paper is called Computational Virtuality in Biological Systems. And I'm just going to read you the abstract because I think it's also quite nice. So the idea of computational virtuality is introduced as a key distinguishing feature of genuinely computational systems. Evidence is provided that the basic cellular machinery process possesses virtuality. Accordingly, one can step beyond the commonplace metaphor of computation as applied to molecular biology and come to view the cell as a genuine computing system. The human nervous system is analyzed in the same light, setting an agenda for research on virtuality in recurrent neural networks, whose outcomes in the way of theoretical results and simulation of biological neural systems heuristically guide neuroscientists in the search for virtual computing in the brain. Now, this is from 2009, so a lot of the kind of current paradigm of machine learning and a lot of the cognitive neuroscience that's happened in the last 10 years, this precedes that. And the part of it that I think is really interesting is when they get to section 2, which is called Algorithms, Computations, and Virtuality. And this is the part that I really wanted to mention here, which is that they take these concepts and try to come up with not so much a definition of algorithms, but more like a list of desirables, you could say. So, and in there's discreteness, finiteness, determinism, and compositionality. And they're saying that they're important, but not essential characteristics of an algorithm. And I wondered if anybody had any thoughts about those things, because I think that some of those are not completely consistent with what we've been talking about.
I would say that I'm loving the determinism and the compositionality in terms of at least a way of describing the sort of idealized concept algorithm, but discreteness and finiteness are interesting. Maybe even finiteness I'll take, but when I look at this from the lens of, say, porting the definition onto, say, a circuit as a thing that computes an algorithm, a filter, etc., that these at least are modeled in continuous time, I sort of, and I guess you could argue that if you go down low enough, you could treat them in discrete terms. But I want this definition to work not just for biological substrates, but to work for other physical non-computers that do computing things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not an amazing definition in and of itself, but I think it's quite provoking. And then they have this interesting diagram where they try to map out various kinds of processes, and they kind of ven up virtuality and algorithms as the kind of two necessary preconditions for computing. So let me just get to that here. And so I wonder if we can kind of finish on this, because I think there's an awful lot to unpack here. So they're kind of trying to put everything in a diagram, which is always quite cool when people try that, ambitious. And so the idea being that they try to characterize some various kinds of algorithms. They try to characterize various systems which exhibit virtuality. And then they try to look at the overlap of those things. And then they look at what's outside of that.
So what I would say then in the things that are outside of virtuality, like analog computers, biological evolution, and some of the stuff on the left, is that I want for a definition that can encapsulate some of them. And in the intervening years, I mean, we've seen even in sort of the evolutionary game theory literature, and there's some like good, like what I would call computer algorithm like framings of observed phenomena that occur, and again the biological evolution and some of these other systems that are modeled after it, they don't quite have the form that people intuit them as having, but when you frame them in terms of certain algorithms, like, you know, I'm not going to tangent too far into that literature, but there's some specific mappings between observed phenomena and algorithmic interpretations of the processes that generate those phenomena, which would mean for me this definition or the thing that I would want for virtuality would actually capture at least some of the things that are outside of this, outside of that circle.
Then maybe let's just pause, and we'll give you their definition of virtuality, which I skipped over because it was just a slide with too much text on it. I was lazy. So the definition, therefore we define virtuality as the property of an. Where are we? We're about 2/3 of the way down, about here. There's the pointer. Yeah, about here. Therefore, we define virtuality as the property of an abstract computing scheme and of a physical computational system as well, such that, and they start from 0 because why not, there exists an effective encoding of the elements of the scheme or the system. The codes provided by such encoding can be applied to specific elements designed as universal or interpreters, such that the universal element realizes the behavior of the coded element, and the codes can be processed by the elements of the system on par with the input and output variables. And that's a very abstract. So
it doesn't like continuous. Basically, this definition formally precludes continuous systems.
So if you look at the very bottom text, they say, according to clause 1, we take virtuality to encompass the normal form or enumeration theorems of the theory of partial recursive functions, together with the existence of a universal Turing machine, while the further results of the theory justifies clause 2 insofar as they're concerned with recursive and hence effectively computable functions. No. So they're being quite specific, which is maybe why a definition that we might want to take today in this context is not so well served.
Right, and actually this just comes back to the...
Maybe it is.
Go ahead.
Say again, Shebnem?
Just one question. So they are not computer scientists, right?
I'm not.
The publisher?
Oh.
No, I mean the author.
This is chemist and a physicist. Chemist and a physicist, as I recall.
Okay,
yes.
So it's cool because how did you call it? The epistemological trespasser?
Exactly.
And literally what it triggered, though, is they are trying to do something that computer scientists and even cyber-physical system engineers, unless they build for critical infrastructures, which the human is, must be kept healthy in that system, unless they are from those, it's actually not included. Like the human is not included, but in our systems, like finite state automata, Bitcoin, and with Turing machines, we already are in Ethereum, and literally people are shilling, and this is why you get a fork, because there was some human mental computing at play. So I like this in a way, and that's what I thought, maybe if you could make sense of this. I believe they're trying to do something that we have to get through.
So maybe we need to, maybe this is our job, Shebnem, maybe we need to update this for the new paradigm for the world that we live in.
Yeah, but I think they're doing quite a good job in the sense they push the right buttons. There's this human mental computing, and the algorithms and virtuality literally spins from that.
Yeah, I think one, I agree with you. Two, I think the thing that's really important for me, if it were to be revised, is that we are able to, even if it just means another circle, address things that are the sort of relation between the discrete and the continuous, because even if we think of both as sort of formalisms that we've chosen, there's actually a really important set of properties that arise from the relation between a discrete and a continuous thing. So even just think about, action potentials and neurons firing, and there's this fundamental thing in the phenomena, or that at least as I see it, help drive some of the observed phenomena that relate not to the discrete or the continuous, but actually are caused by some interaction effect between the discrete and the continuous. So a way of sort of modeling the world, a formalism that would actually help us address some of these kinds of richer mixed problems pretty much has to have both, because without both, it can't have any way of representing the effects that the sort of sampling and or sort of events relative to continuous processes have. And there's this weird entangling that happens when you look at, again, real phenomena where their best explanations are, well, here's the the connection between the continuous process, which arguably is discrete at a lower level, and a discrete outcome or event, which is arguably, you can make arguments for sort of event-based chronologies for time and continuous time-based representations, and that there's something really interesting that happens when the two interact. And so, yeah, I'm done rambling about this, but it's very exciting. I just feel like I need them together to understand these kinds of systems.
Yeah.
But there
Guys,
is no
I will say, I will zoom out now because I'm almost falling asleep.
Okay, we're gonna wrap in a few minutes, Sherman. If you can hold on, it's up to you.
All right. Okay.
All right. Yeah, this is the end. We're at the end now. Yeah. Go ahead, Sherman.
So just a question, there is no unified model of this. You either look at a system that is continuous or discrete, or you look at those from these models, from discrete or continuous models, or the systems are...
Are you asking me, or...
Yeah. Yeah,
I mean, so there are hybrid systems models that they're just models. So it comes back to our mixed perspectives, right? You represent some phenomena as continuous, some as discrete, and then if there are relationships between those phenomena, then you might have actual, expressions of phenomena in terms of the interaction effect of the discrete and continuous expressions. So it's a challenge of modeling at the end of the day, because we could argue that there is obviously no right model, but some of the simplest useful models of phenomena we really observe are actually a simple representation of something continuous, a simple representation of something discrete, and most of the interesting stuff happens because there are weird interaction effects between the fact that component or an element was best modeled continuous, one was best modeled discrete, at least, again, in the context of some specific application. And so I'm just kind of pushing on the fact that I'm excited by what I see here, but I really want some whatever the simplest machinery is to have the ability for it to sort of evidence these things where the discrete and the continuous again, combined to do something interesting and weird, but also evidenced in our observations, like an activation potential building up and a neuron firing as an example. But I mean, it's just a thought, right?
Laura, are you still there? Are you still awake?
Yes, I'm still awake.
Well, what do you see in this diagram? Because it's trying to cover so much ground in a way. It's like a super ambitious thing. But also it's perhaps of its time, and it's perhaps informed by the training and the backgrounds of the people that created it. So I wonder, through this the philosophical or a social science lens, when you look at something like this, do you see any anomalies? Do you see anything that you'd like to add to it?
But honestly, I mean, as you said, that's exactly what I see. I see something that tries to cover everything pretty much, whereas I feel a lot more comfortable with notions of situated perspective, contextual awareness, and porous imperfection, going back to what we've just been discussing. So I find it, I don't know, I find it, clearly this is not also, perhaps my specialty. So
and it's also it's
this generic generalizing kind of attempt, but certainly I'm sure that people that have a certain mind that is more trained than mine to see certain aspects.
I think this is what it looks like if a formalist tries to do realism. I think that's maybe what it looks like.
Perhaps, yeah. Yeah.
So we've been going for I don't even know how long. It's almost midnight here in Berlin. So I propose that we I propose that we wrap it up. So if anybody's got any closing thoughts on the topics that we've been discussing, or questions to pose for the next iteration or the next topic or the next salon, then now's the time, and we'll wrap it up in a few minutes.
From my part, I think everything has been said. We've been covering a lot of ground. There's not much to add. And there was this one topic that I suggested, but I forgot it now for the next salon.
Oh, we'll come back to it then. Yes, we'll come back to it. Shebnem, Z?
I was just going to say thanks for organizing. I mean, it was fun to explore these ideas with this group, and obviously it's all pretty open-ended. So.
It's a nice experiment, and I think it worked, so I think we should try it again.
Yeah, definitely. And it would be great if you could put it online. I mean, for whoever is interested to tap into those 4 hours, but I think we've covered, like, you really did a very good job to kind of structure this salon tonight, and we've covered so much ground and invested a lot of time, so maybe it can be useful for other people.
Yeah, so what we'll do is I'll get the recordings, assuming the recording works, and then I'll check it and I'll send it to all of you and make sure that you agree. And if once we get that, then we'll be formalists about this. Why not be formal?
Okay.
Rigorous.
Rigorous, yeah. And Shebnem, you have any closing thoughts?
So thank you all for this 4 hours. It really opened up and answered some of my questions that I had. And I guess my ideal, and it came but no one said the words, is my ideal would be to use all of this algorithmic realism to actually have that ideal of this sovereign individual. That would be something I would, aspire to, that we put that to use for not nations, not politicians, but actually for the individual who can use these tools. And
realistic idealism.
True formalism. Oh no.
And Laura, you have any final thoughts?
Likewise, thanks so much. Thanks for having me. It's been really great to explore all these wealth of ideas and get some more, just circulate ideas and develop thoughts in relation to all this. We did cover a lot of ground. And it's
a lot
great to do with you all.
Yeah,
it's been great.
Yeah, so let's look for another topic to push this on for the next time. Doesn't have to be so soon. We can think about that. Let these ideas breathe a little bit. So yeah, thank you all for joining. So we had Laura Lotti, Shebnem Rzicka, Shonen Voshumge, Michael Zager, myself, Wasim Al-Sindi. So, and thank you. If you listened to this all the way to the end, you're insane, and thank you. All right.
Have a great
Bye, everyone.
evening.
Good night. Ciao.
Bye-bye.
Ciao from Berlin. Bye.